Chapter 1058. Uncle D, have you heard of this big demon beast? The monster was stunned. Its small eyes subconsciously scanned the surrounding space. Obviously, it was extremely afraid of this name. I've heard of it, but I've never seen it. I heard that it's a very great big demon beast among the void beasts in the anti-space. Its realm is very high. I don't know about small demons. Why? Is this gathering of the beast race gathered by it? Oh, if I had known this, I wouldn't have delayed halfway and missed such a great opportunity. Lu Xiaoyi inquired carefully, but the monster didn't know much. It kept repeating the same few sentences, and it seemed that its knowledge was limited. He was bored and waved his hand to let it go. However, this monster was a pushover. At first, its fear gradually disappeared. When it saw that the human cultivator didn't embarrass it, it became a little shameless. Fellow cultivator, I see that you're active in the anti-space. I think you have a way to go to the main world. I'm shameless enough to ask, can you take me with you when you go to the main world? I'll definitely repay you generously. Lu Xiaoyi frowned. In the cultivation world, there were few such gratuitous favors. Everyone cared about their reputation. They also knew that they were entangled with karma and didn't want to owe favors casually. Therefore, even if it was a real friend, they rarely asked for favors casually. Of course, the one standing in front of him now was not a human. Maybe things like void beasts were so straightforward? Repay? How thick are they? The monster also knew that it had to pay a price for asking for help. It hurriedly took out things from its arms. It was a messy pile. There were stones, wooden blocks, and some materials that he couldn't identify at all. Lu Xiaoyi could see that these were indeed things of cultivation. They were very spiritual, but they didn't look good. He didn't know much about the materials of utensils, so he couldn't identify any of them. As the monster took them out, it was complacent and boasted. This is a stone from the beginning of the universe's chaos. I don't know its name, but I know its origin. This is the beard of the Jianmu. I picked it up by chance. This is the essence of yin and yang, a spiritual object of heaven and earth. This is Lu Xiaoyi's side. This thing might be a good thing, and he could roughly feel it from its aura. But wasn't it bragging too much? He couldn't see the exact origin of the item, but he guessed that it was nothing more than a tattered item that the monster had picked up while wandering in the void of the universe. As long as one was willing to collect such items, cultivators could find countless of them in the universe. He had no choice but to interrupt it. Wait, my orthodoxy doesn't value external objects. I can't accept these things of yours, so you should keep them. However, I have no intention of returning to the origin world right now. Let's talk about it when I want to return. The demon was somewhat disappointed, but he did not force the issue. I can wait. Even if I have to wait for hundreds or thousands of years, I can still wait. Fellow Taoist, if you don't like external objects, then you must be pursuing special environments and opportunities, right? I'm quite familiar with the negative space. I can bring you to a few places. I can guarantee that you've never been there before. It's very beneficial for human cultivation. Lu Xiaoyi was non-committal. Going through the complicated weather of the reverse space with a monster he met for the first time, he wasn't stupid enough to do that. Thus, he continued to work hard to deepen his understanding of the path of space. To a cultivator, any successful establishment of a space passage was worth remembering. He had no intention of returning to the origin world to take a look at the Changshuo domain. To him, if there was a problem with Changshuo, it would be useless for him to return now. If there was no problem, there was no point in returning. It would be a waste of time to go back and forth. To him, there was a more interesting target, and that was the seemingly cowardly monster, Fei Fei. There were many unreasonable and many reasonable things. There was no point in delving into the reasons, but in his intuition, he felt that this thing was very strange. It was not as harmless and timid as it looked on the surface. What was the purpose of this thing's behavior? This was what he wanted to know. Two coincidences. One was to send the group of beasts through without any reason, and the other was to leave this thing behind for no reason. If taken out individually, it might not be much, but if the two coincidences were put together, then there must be some kind of connection between them. Kill it, It might be very simple, but he didn't lack such a yawning void beast in his battle record. This thing wanted to go to the origin world. Was it real or fake? Was it taking this opportunity to get close to it? Or was it something else? He couldn't judge, but the best way was to delay it. He wanted to see what this thing meant when it said that it could wait for hundreds or thousands of years. As far as he knew, void beasts were impatient and tyrannical. As long as there was something on their mind, let alone hundreds or thousands of years, they couldn't even wait for a few years. He wanted to see who would lose their cool first. Fei was pacing back and forth in the airspace near the road sign, feeling a little excited. It was a Fei, with the cultivation level of a half-immortal. Of course, it was the lowest level among the half-immortals. It wasn't a low-level creature like the void beast. In the universe cultivation world, existences like it had a thunderous name, immemorial sacred beast. It was also called immemorial fierce beast, depending on who called it that. In their eyes, phoenixes, dragons, and rocks were immemorial fierce beasts, and vice versa. With its roots, it actually didn't need to search for opportunities in the universe void. In the Heaven's Choice continent, there was a large area that belonged to immemorial sacred beasts. The conditions were better, and it was more carefree. It didn't need to search for food in the universe like the void beasts. But it was different. More than 10,000 years ago, it was also very prosperous. Among the half-immortals in the Heaven's Choice continent, its words were very firm, and everyone was very polite when they saw it. It was a great honor to call it Uncle D. It wasn't that its bloodline was noble, nor was it that its strength was outstanding, but it was hugging the thickest thigh in the Heaven's Choice continent. Actually, it wasn't just the Heaven's Choice continent. It was the same in the origin world. Those days were really unforgettable for it. It was the peak of its life, but unfortunately, after the peak, it was a cliff. It didn't know what happened to its thigh, but it couldn't take it anymore and collapsed. Now, a follower like it had to endure all kinds of hardships, suffering the fickleness of a beast's emotions. It couldn't stay in the Heaven's Choice continent any longer, especially after its only companion was killed. It knew that if it continued to stay in the Heaven's Choice continent, it would have the same ending as its companion. It couldn't stay in the Heaven's Choice continent, and it didn't dare to go to the origin world. Because it was the territory of the immemorial fierce beasts, there was only one place for it to stay, and that was the endless void of the negative space. It ended up with the same fate as the void beasts. For more than 10,000 years, it had been drifting around like this, dressing itself up as a void beast, hiding its noble bloodline, and no longer mentioning its former glory. Chapter 1059. It wasn't its idea that the void beast wanted to go to the origin world. For an ancient sacred beast like it, it was very clear that no matter where it went, there was no difference in essence. But it did have a role in adding fuel to the fire. The collapse of the Great Tao was actually the same for the origin world's negative space. The key problem was that the cultivators of the Heaven's Choice continent relied too much on the Tao tablets. When the Tao tablets collapsed, they lost the ability to experience and comprehend the Great Tao. Unlike the cultivators of the origin world, they never had any Tao tablets. Their comprehension of the Great Tao came purely from nature, from bits and pieces of cultivation. So, the key was the mentality. If you didn't change this path of comprehending the Great Tao through the Tao tablets, then no matter where you went, it would be the same. Even if you went to the origin world, you still wouldn't be able to comprehend the Great Tao. Similarly, if a cultivator could comprehend the Great Tao without the help of the Tao tablets, then he could succeed anywhere, whether it was the origin world or the Heaven's Choice continent. As long as it was in the universe, the Great Tao was everywhere. The four great swans had never been on equal footing. Although Hong Mao had successfully established the four great swans in the negative space and passed it down to this day, before the collapse of the Great Tao and the beginning of a new era, Hong Mao's inheritance inevitably had loopholes. This was the advantage of the mainstream. Whether or not one could keep up with the changes didn't depend on where one went, but on the change in one's attitude towards cultivation. These couldn't be discussed with the void beasts, and there was no need for it to say these. When one was comprehending the great Tao, no one had a reason to easily pass on what they had painstakingly comprehended, and others might not be willing to listen. The origin world had a great opportunity. No one knew where it came from. Perhaps it was the void beast's own comprehension, or perhaps it was passed down by word of mouth from some humans, but it had been passed down for a very long time. It started from the collapse of the great Tao of merit and intensified after the collapse of the great Tao of void. Whether it was the great Tao of merit or the great Tao of void, it had nothing to do with the void beasts. But they were afraid of the other great Taos, such as the power of slaughter and destruction and the 5 elements. If these great Taos collapsed, it would have a very real impact on them. It was basically impossible to count on one of the heavenly void beasts to reach the Tao integration stage in the future. However, they were the most loyal supporters of the great Tao. Once the great Tao collapsed, they would be greatly affected, and they would lose their sense of direction. The rumors accumulated for hundreds of years and gradually formed a consensus among the void beasts. They decided to go to the origin world to find their future. Of course, although the absolute number of void beasts that were willing to take this step was terrifying, it was insignificant when compared to the entire anti-space void beasts. They needed a leader, or at least a leader in name. Therefore, some of the big monsters thought of Fei Di, who had been famous among the monsters in the anti-space for the past 10,000 years. Regarding this, he didn't support it, but he didn't oppose it either. Instead, he was willing to take on the role of a commander-in-chief and provide a certain amount of assistance when needed. The other void beasts would never be able to guess the deeper meaning behind this. When the great path of merit and virtue collapsed, even Lu Xiaoyi and the other Jin Dan cultivators could make countless guesses and deductions, not to mention the half-immortal body. This made it very excited, because its leg might still be around. The difficulties of the past 10,000 years made it understand that it couldn't force itself to stand out. Hiding its strength and biding its time was the main point. However, it also wanted to do something to tell its leg that it was still alive. It still didn't dare to return to the Heaven's Choice continent. The other sacred beasts were afraid that it would seek revenge after finding its leg, so it was very likely that they would get rid of it in advance and end everything once and for all. It still didn't dare to go to the origin world, because the ferocious beasts in the origin world wouldn't care who its leg was, and it couldn't prove itself. Therefore, he thought of a brilliant plan that would satisfy both sides. He would make use of the anti-space void beast transmigration to the origin world to make his name known. If his backer was really still around and knew that the mastermind behind the void beast tide might be one of his old acquaintances, then he would definitely come looking for him. It achieved its goal and was more covert, because it estimated that if its leg was still around, then the possibility of it remaining in the origin world was much higher than remaining in the anti-space, no matter what kind of existence it was. It wasn't in a hurry. After successfully sending out this wave, it would wait for the next wave to let the void beasts in the anti-space know that Fatty D was the only one who could organize this kind of illegal transmigration. When a number of void beasts transmigrating to the origin world increased, sooner or later, its leg would realize that there was still a loyal lackey waiting for it in the anti-space Heaven's Choice continent. This was its real goal. As for Chang Shua's position, it was just one of the many weak points in the anti-space transmigration barrier. It wasn't chosen by it, but by the true monarch void beasts. These things were born in the universe and grew up in the universe, so they had their own instincts towards similar situations. For a half-immortal level ancient sacred beast like Chang Shua, the number of transmigration points it could pass through was much more. It couldn't be too obvious in there. Firstly, it was afraid of being stained with the karma of the heavens, and secondly, it was afraid of being targeted by other enemies. It acted very reluctantly, but in fact, it didn't do any specific work. The beast horde was gathered by the true monarchs and Yuaniing great demons, while it stayed here to take charge. In name, This was the only way to avoid the inexplicable power in the underworld. The whole process was quite smooth. According to its judgment, these void beasts still needed to spend a lot of time to find a way to break the barrier, so it didn't plan to make a move. However, when it arrived at Chang Shua's coordinates, an unexpected discovery disrupted all its plans. There was someone in the meteorite. It immediately realized that the Yuanying great demon's concealment was a joke to a half-immortal like it. However, it didn't personally make a move to find him, because its leg was also a human. This made it very careful when facing humans in its 10,000 years of wandering. Most importantly, this was a swordsman, just like its previous leg. The whole process was under its watch. It didn't have the slightest intention of interfering. At this point, it didn't care about what would happen to the void beasts. It was more concerned about the human swordsman hiding in the meteorite. It saw with its own eyes that he sent the void beasts further away in the universe. It could understand that this was for the safety of the Chang Shua domain, but this wasn't important. What was important was that it had a feeling that made its heart beat faster. It hadn't had this feeling for more than 10,000 years. For this feeling, it personally blocked the perception of countless void beasts. For this feeling, it allowed the swordsman to freely guide the space around it, let alone being guided to a faraway universe. It didn't even care if it was guided to hell. For this feeling, it disguised itself as a timid void beast, just to understand more about this person. There must be some connection. However, it couldn't be sure at the moment. This was because it didn't have a very close relationship with the leg in the beginning. There were many that hugged the leg, and it could only be considered as the periphery, not the core. Chapter 1060. In the vast void of the negative space, a silent traveler was moving quickly. From the way he moved, one could not tell his origin and could not even accurately determine whether he was a monk or a Taoist. His figure and appearance did not reveal his identity. His face was shrouded in a ball of faint light, which blocked the divine sense and could not be seen through. He had been flying for a long time, but fortunately, this was a familiar journey for him. He had flown countless times and was familiar with where there were celestial phenomena, where there were dark whirlpools, and where there were stars. Gradually, a barren star appeared in his divine sense. This was his destination, a lonely journey in the negative space. Not only were there few stars, even the void beasts were pitifully few. He did not even see one along the way and did not know what had happened. He slowly approached the star and carefully expanded his divine sense to the maximum. Not only did he scan the star, but he also scanned the surroundings to prevent any possible stalkers. This was just a habit. After he took on this mission, he did not encounter any accidents in the dozens of trips, but this was not a reason for him to be careless. The reason why he was sent was because of his cautious nature. There were no accidents, he was very sure. Thus, he began to approach the desolate star. In a deep crater, a cultivator was waiting for him. The two of them were as mysterious as each other. It was impossible to see through each other's roots and inheritances. The only difference was that the cultivator who arrived first was dressed in a black robe, and the one who arrived later was dressed in a green robe. "You're late," the black-robed cultivator complained. "It's you who came too early." The green-robed cultivator did not care. There was no need to exchange pleasantries. It was not the first time the two of them met, and they knew the rules very well. The green-robed cultivator took out an item and handed it over. "This is the key to the king's house relay point. There are rules in the bounded domain, and the key is changed every 500 years. Don't just use it in one place. It will easily expose your whereabouts." The black-robed cultivator took it and examined it carefully. He smiled and said, "You're a cautious one. It's going to change it. Recently, there was some trouble at the Changshuo relay point, and I wanted to inform you if you want to change your location. I didn't expect you to predict the future. That's great. Everyone will be relieved." The green-robed cultivator was very alert. "What trouble? I've told you long ago that you must inform each other no matter how big or small the matter is. Otherwise, it won't look good for everyone." The black-robed man snorted. Isn't it too late? You're so impatient. It's like this, the relay point of Changshuo has recently been replaced by one of your Zhou Xian's cultivators. So, they have a lot of money. Coincidentally, Heaven's Choice recently had a group of smugglers who wanted to go to the origin world through the long Shuo point. We were afraid that these people didn't know the rules and acted rashly, causing trouble, so we sent some cultivators to intercept them. In the end, the matter wasn't kept secret, and they were all smashed by your Zhou Xian guardian. The green-robed man was infuriated. I told you a long time ago to keep your mouth shut and organize properly, but he refused to listen. How did those private guests sneak in? Without the secret key that you leaked, how could they coincidentally control the entrance and exit of the Changshuo point? This is great. How do you know that your so-called dissuaders won't leak anything? The man in black explained. It can't be completely avoided, right? After all, it's been several hundred years. It's hard to avoid leaks if they only go through Changsha. How can we be sure that it was leaked from within? As for the cultivators we sent out, don't worry. They're just yuanning. They don't even know what's going on, so what can they leak? In any case, we're about to change relay points. That guardian doesn't have any evidence, so he can't say anything. The green-robed man suppressed the anger in his heart. He knew that arguing now was useless and wouldn't solve the problem. However, he attached great importance to the black-robed man's words and didn't want to let it go so easily. That guardian cultivator should be from the carefree wandering sect. It's their turn to be on duty for the past 100 years. Do you know his name? The black-robed man laughed. Of course I do. We've been at Changshuo for several hundred years. We're familiar with the path, so we'll definitely place our own people at Changsha. This person's name is Shan Er. He should be a swordsman. Why do you know him? The green-robed man took a deep breath. Although he hadn't seen this person before, he was someone who had humiliated the two great Buddhist sects in Zhou. He was someone who they couldn't take revenge on. Even though the Buddhist sect had countless spies in the 7 great Taoist sects, they still didn't know that this person had been sent to Changshuo to guard the road signs. This was also the reason why cultivator spies were greatly reduced when they arrived at Yuanying. Both Buddhist sects wanted to get rid of this person as soon as possible, but they were unable to track him down. Every time this person left the outerverse void, he was always alone, and no one knew exactly where he was going. Thus, it never had a chance. The green-robed man had to come up with a plan now. Otherwise, if he went back and forth, reported to the sect, and found a suitable fighter, it would take a few years. It would be easy to miss the opportunity. If this person returned, where would they find him? Now was the perfect opportunity. The negative space was vast and sparsely populated. It was the best environment for them to strike. It was also during the mission period. The negative space was dangerous and unpredictable. Human void beasts would occasionally appear, but there was no way to find them. It was the right time. Now that the person guarding the heavens chosen was by his side, if they acted, no one would know. It was the right time, the right place, and the right people were there. What was there to hesitate about? Although this was a little beyond his authority, he couldn't miss such a great opportunity. When he returned and reported it, the temple would definitely praise him and not punish him. Thus, he made up his mind. This person must be eliminated. To prevent implicating him, you heaven's chosen cultivators have to act. Only then can we create an accident. Although the black-robed man didn't agree, both sides were in the same boat and couldn't shirk away. This was actually related to their own plans. All right, since you have a request, we will send a few more people over. The green-robed man was very dissatisfied with his perfunctory response. You must remember that this person's strength is very impressive. You said it yourself that more than 10 Yuanying were defeated by him. How can you just send a few people to deal with such a person? Don't send any more Yuanying to their deaths. We will send Supremes. At least 2 more. We must kill a chicken with a butcher's knife. We must succeed in one strike and save ourselves from countless troubles when we return. Once it's done, I will report it to the sect and strive to obtain another relay point for you. The black-robed man seemed to have understood something. There was no need to ask. This person had a great enmity with this carefree cultivator. He wanted to use the heavens' chosen cultivators to kill him. However, this wasn't much. They also had a debt of blood of 12 yuanying. Moreover, they could obtain another relay point. This was a price worth paying. All right, it's settled then. You obtain another relay point for us, and we will hunt down this person for you. Don't worry. If we really want to do it, how can we let him do as he pleases? Last time, it was just an unintentional move. We didn't send many strong people, so he took advantage of the loophole. When I return, I will arrange for the most mysterious supremes of the heavens' chosen cultivators to kill him. It's better if we don't make a move ourselves and don't leave any traces. It's better for everyone. What do you think? The green-robed man nodded. That would be for the best. However, don't be reluctant to invest. We must hire the best. Chapter 1061. Lu Xiaoyi's days were very boring. He was now competing with a void beast in terms of patience, and he felt that victory was in his hands. That strange fellow had been moving around in the airspace near the waymark. It seemed that it was determined to eat him up and wanted to follow him back to the main world. This was the first time he had seen such a persistent void beast. Moreover, it was not shy with strangers. Under its wretched appearance, it had the potential to be a dogskin plaster. It was as if Lu Xiaoyi's appearance was enough to eat it up. It did not have the vigilance and fear of humans that normal void beasts had. Why did it think that the humans would not attack it? Why did it think that the humans would just kill it? Lu Xiaoyi could not figure out its intentions, no matter how hard he thought about it. Perhaps it was deliberately dragging him out to wait for its companions to arrive? That was the most likely possibility. In the cultivation world, strength was respected. This was the principle. Any action that did not follow this principle could bring about a disaster to oneself. Because life and death were too common among cultivation creatures, there was no legal system to restrict them. As long as it was not another beast tied, Lu Xiaoyi did not care. The combat power of the void beasts was not worth mentioning in his eyes. Their more crude and direct instinctive divine abilities did not mean much to a swordsman like him. What he was really afraid of was the endless control methods of human monks and magical cultivators. Of course, he would not always stay in the meteorite and wait for prey. He would often come out for a stroll. At the same time, with the waymark as the center, he would set up his own warning line in the three-dimensional space within a certain range. He was a battle-hungry person. This was his nature. From when he first started on the path of Tao, he only wanted to be a rice worm. Now, he had completely let go of his instincts. He had been in Changshuo for decades, but in reality, he had not had a real battle. This made his hands itch. He did not care about yuanying void beasts. Monarchs were good opponents. As long as it was not a beast tide, he could still deal with a few monarch void beasts. However, the prerequisite was that he had to take the initiative to discover them, take the initiative to attack, and control the rhythm. This required him to have complete control over the airspace around the waymark, which was not easy. Setting up a security perimeter in the universe was different from setting it up in the domain. It was a three-dimensional layer with no blind spots. Spell cultivators were the best at this. The Sorvain did not have many methods to set up a security perimeter like this. The best method was to release a group of flying swords and use them to strengthen one's senses at the maximum distance of one's consciousness. It was not difficult for him to release dozens of sword lights to form a sphere of perception around him, since he was already capable of splitting hundreds of thousands of sword lights. There was no need to talk about consumption at all. Apart from that, he had also used the three-point hyacinth to carve out several different dimensional linear spaces in several important directions. This was his specific application of the great path of space. Due to his weak spatial ability, he could not maintain a stable dimensional space and put himself in it. Hence, he could only create some linear, unstable spaces. This was not for show, but a strategy. In the universe, such linear, unstable spaces could be seen everywhere. They had no effect on the cultivators who passed through them. Cultivators were already used to it. However, if a cultivator set it up consciously, it would provide a long-distance warning to the person who set it up. Although he was belligerent and cautious, There was nothing to be embarrassed about. There was another advantage to doing this. He could familiarize himself with the application of the great path of space anytime and anywhere. Practice makes perfect. This was the truth for cultivators. There were no skills, great path, spells, or methods that could be converted into combat power through comprehension alone. Comprehension was comprehension. Familiarity was familiarity. After comprehension, repeated familiarity was the correct way to improve oneself. He did this to prepare time for himself to react. Secondly, he wanted to see Monster Fatty's reaction. Unfortunately, Monster Fatty did not react at all. It just leisurely circled around the waymark. To void beasts, this was not flying. In fact, it was a kind of rest. They could stay in this state forever, like a wild boar sleeping in its nest. Its mentality was very relaxed. What a unique void beast. Fatty was like a ghost, floating in the darkness of the void. Competing with him in patience? It had been floating in this kind of environment for tens of thousands of years. This little guy was still very young. It had thought of many ways to get close to this little guy. In the end, it decided not to appear in the state of a half-immortal. This was because it would cause a lot of unnecessary separation and it would not be able to get close. How would a little Yuaniing understand the initiative of a half-immortal? One who was solicitous for no reason was hiding evil intentions. This was the inevitable mentality. Only when they were both in the realm of Yuaniing would they appear to be incompetent, brainless, and shameless. It was very clear that its thigh did not dislike this kind of character that was full of problems. What its thigh really hated were those who pretended to be virtuous and virtuous. It could also use this to verify whether this swordsman was the one in its heart. Everything else could be changed, but the things in the depths of its soul would not change. For example, it knew that although its thigh was full of blood debts, he would never kill indiscriminately. Just like the strength and behavior it was displaying now, most human cultivators would not care about it. Chasing it away was a light punishment. Killing it was also very normal. What was a void beast? It was not even worth mentioning karma. But its thigh would not be killed. Its thigh's temper was that it would rather kill those with deep karma, endless troubles, extremely evil, and high status than kill these insignificant little ants. At that time, it was because of this reason that it clung to its thigh. Now, it seemed that it was within its expectations. This little guy had a lot of thoughts and was very cunning. However, it did not have the intention to kill it. This was a little reliable. At its realm, it understood all kinds of taboos, rules, and mysterious influences more thoroughly than others. It knew what could be done and did not need to be timid. Similarly, it also knew what could not be done and must not be touched. As for its thigh, it also had a set of effective methods to get in touch with it. It was not like the wild boar who did not dare to do anything and was afraid of being punished by the heavenly Tao. It was even more afraid that it would affect the rise of its thigh. To Fat D, everything was just a clue. It could not confirm anything, whether it was its thigh or not, or whether it was related to its thigh. It still needed a long time to prove it. The secrets of cultivation, especially those related to the immortal court, were not things that a small half-immortal like it could touch. In front of those old fellows in the immortal world, it was just an insensible baby. Babies had to do what babies did. If it had to speak the human language when it was born, it would be burned to death as a demon. This was the reason why it could survive, but its companion, who was also a half-immortal, did not. It had to live, even if it meant losing its face. Only by living could it be qualified to enjoy the possible miracles. Chapter 1062. Its performance was very successful. It was easy for a half-immortal to hide his strength in front of a small Yuaniing. After all, the difference between their realms was too great, so great that it made one feel hopeless. However, there were also side effects. Because the act was too real, it was difficult for the relationship between both parties to have any real progress in a short period of time. Of course, it didn't matter if it was stuck in a deadlock for another 1,000 years. However, the little guy was different. He would leave this place in a few decades. How could it follow him out? There were many ferocious, immemorial beasts in the origin world, like the phoenix and the Kuan Pong. It wasn't a match for them at all. It didn't even have the chance to struggle and escape. To these immemorial beasts, there was an ancient convention that they wouldn't enter each other's universe. Of course, if you were strong, you could ignore these rules. However, for a weakling like it had to abide by the rules. Then, how could it establish a stable relationship with the little guy in these few decades? It didn't need to be too intimate, and it wasn't realistic. However, at least when the little guy came to the negative space, he would remember that he had such a useful friend. It couldn't be too proactive. It would make him suspicious. If it didn't take the initiative, it wouldn't have a chance, and it would be even more suspicious. Even though Fatty D had a long lifespan, it was helpless in this situation. Making a friend was very simple. Making a true friend was too difficult, even harder than reaching the upper realm. It couldn't think of any good ideas for the time being. It could only wait and hope that there would be a change. If it was before the beast tide, it would deliberately take care of a group of beasts and pretend to loot this place. Then, it would play a role in it to gain the little guy's trust. However, now, the void beasts in a large area of the void domain had been wiped out. They had gone to the origin world to have fun. Where would it find another void beast in a short period of time? It was really difficult to kill a monster. In the silent void, two figures flew over from the direction of the heavenly choice continent. Their speed was extremely fast, and their auras were faintly discernible. It was as if they were two void beasts that perfectly fused together with their surroundings. A few days away from the Changshuo relay point, the two figures slowed down. One of the cultivators whose face was shrouded in nothingness looked in front and said coldly, "Tian, are you familiar with this void domain?" The other, similarly mysterious cultivator shook his head. "I've never been here before. The negative space is so big. Who knows it?" "Tianny, just say it directly. Do you want the two of us to attack together or one by one? Who's first?" Tian, these weren't their original names. They were just temporary code names. In the assassin business, they would never easily reveal their roots. In the Heaven's Choice continent, there was actually no specialized assassin organization. There was only this kind of platform. As for where the assassins came from, they were actually cultivators for various countries' orthodoxies. They usually put on airs in their respective orthodoxies, protecting their orthodoxies and educating their disciples. When they came out to do things, they would cover their faces and become assassins. In fact, it was purely for the sake of spiritual opportunity, the purple purity spiritual opportunity. In theory, every cultivator in Heaven's Choice could become one of the assassins on the platform as long as you had the strength. Of course, only a small number of cultivators actually did this. Those who had sufficient resources and a firm Tao heart, but insufficient combat strength, did not have such demands. In the end, those who were able to make a name for themselves in this business were all ruthless, bloodthirsty, and thrill-seeking cultivators. Their orthodoxies were pure, and their methods were plentiful. They were the regular army of assassins, and also the assassins of the regular army. They were the part of the Heaven's Choice continent with the highest asking price. Just like these two, they were both relatively famous true monarch assassins on the Heaven's Choice assassin platform. They each had their own brilliant battle records, and their asking price was very high. Now, two of them were sent to deal with a single Yuanying. It was enough to show how much the bitter valued and feared the target. True monarchs attacking Yuanying didn't mean much to some people in the cultivation world. It wasn't like the middle and lower levels, where the pressure of realms was everything. When cultivators reached Yuanying, they could go out into the void of the universe. There were no restrictions in the vast space, unlike in the bounded domain where there were so many pairs of eyes watching, so it was a common sight. For some cultivators who were persistent and had a bottom line, they would still have some misgivings. But for a profession like assassins, there were no psychological barriers. If they cared about everything, why would they be assassins? In the code of conduct of assassins, killing a chicken with a butcher's knife was a very important rule to ensure the success rate. There was nothing strange about it, and no one would feel ashamed about it. What they were discussing now was whether to attack with 1 or 2 people. It wasn't because of the glory of being a cultivator. If they came out to kill for the sake of resources and spiritual opportunity, what glory was there to talk about? The first code of conduct of assassins was to kill a chicken with a butcher's knife. The second code was to attack sneakily, and the third code was to bully with numbers. Achieving the goal was the primary consideration, and nothing else was involved. This was purely a question of technique. Because in this kind of long-distance attack, if one wasn't familiar with the environment, the opponent wasn't familiar with, and the location was uncertain, it would be very difficult to balance the second and third code. If one wanted to launch a sneak attack, one couldn't have too many people. More people would increase the chances of being exposed. If one wanted to fight with numbers, it would be very difficult to launch a sneak attack. So, what they were actually discussing was whether to launch a sneak attack, or 2 against 1. A sneak attack could unleash an assassin's explosive power to the greatest extent, and there was no need to worry. If it was 2 against 1, they would lose the initiative to attack. Moreover, there would be a lack of coordination between them. After all, they were from different orthodoxies and had never come into contact with each other. Until now, they didn't even know who the other party was, so how could they talk about working together? They were already bullying the weak. As famous assassins, they still had their own pride. So, the 2 of them were leaning towards sneaking in and launching a sneak attack, one at the front and one at the back. Who would attack first and who would attack second would be decided by the 2 of them guessing. The reward was a total, and had to be split between the 2 of them. So, who would end up with the reward in the end was very important. It was a matter of how much the reward would be split. The final result was that Tian was in front, and Tian was at the back. The 2 of them slowed down and approached cautiously. For an assassin, how to approach the opponent in stealth was a basic skill. If one didn't have this ability, they could only rely on brute force. That would be a tactic to break through enemy lines, and not the way of an assassin. Tian was a true Lord in spirit. The moment he made his move, he immediately exposed his orthodoxy. He should be of the beast tamer lineage. His sneaking in the void was simple and effective. He released the void beast that he had reared, and he embedded himself in the void beast's mouth. He didn't completely retract his aura, but allowed his aura to synchronize with the void beasts. From an outsider's point of view, it was a lonely yuanying void beast wandering blindly in the universe. He followed all the habits of void beasts and didn't reveal a single trace of himself. This method had a miraculous effect in the void of the universe, but it couldn't be used in a domain. It was a very suitable sneaking method for the situation. Tian trailed far behind. He was of orthodox Taoist origin and used orthodox spatial Tao treasures. Similarly, he was silent. This method of his was suitable for the void and was also suitable for the atmosphere of a domain. The only flaw was that he could be identified visually. This wasn't a fatal flaw. For a true lord, the attack range was far beyond the visual range. By the time the opponent saw him, the battle would have already begun. Chapter 1063. It leisurely streaked across the void like a normal patrolling void beast. There was an advantage to this method, which was that it could openly break into a cultivator's possible defenses without worrying. It saved him the trouble of carefully sneaking in and cracking the defenses. The more he did, the easier it was to make mistakes. Under Tian's control, the void beast didn't have a fixed direction. Instead, it pretended to be unintentional, but on the whole, it approached Changshua's waymark relay point step by step. Tian believed that no cultivator would have any doubts about him. If they had to doubt this, then there was nothing in the universe that couldn't be doubted. Countless void beasts and countless stars would sooner or later have their minds split. He couldn't spread his divine sense too far. It had to be consistent with the identity of a yuanying void beast. Otherwise, the other party would immediately realize the abnormality of his void beast. If the opponent was a powerful yuanying, their divine sense would definitely be above the void beasts. and they would be discovered before he could find his prey. This was his only weakness, but he didn't care. Even the most brutal human cultivator wouldn't attack a void beast they saw in the void of the universe. They would die of exhaustion. His goal was to immediately launch the long-planned attack combination when the void beast's divine sense discovered the opponent. He wanted to achieve the surprise of the attack at the first moment. With his means as a monarch, as long as he started, the opponent wouldn't have a chance to attack. Occasionally, sword light flashed past his surroundings, but he remained unmoved. He knew that this was a perception-type flying sword released by the opponent and wasn't offensive. It only meant that he was getting closer and closer to the opponent, so close that he had already entered the opponent's perception range. This was good news. What the two of them couldn't stand the most was that the opponent had gone to the origin world, so they had to wait here. Waiting for a few months or even a few years was truly annoying. Now, the opponent was still in the negative space, so they had hope of completing their mission quickly. To an assassin, waiting meant that there might be changes, and it meant that new problems might arise. Fatty D looked coldly at everything that was happening in front of it. For a half-immortal like it, human monarchs, especially those who weren't young god monarchs, were simply not enough. From afar, before the two killers had even slowed down and started to discuss, it had already targeted them. From the way they moved stealthily, it could see that they were up to no good. To be honest, it was very happy, because the opportunity to get closer to the little guy had come. Since he wanted to reach out and save someone, he had to seize the opportunity. If you rush up and kill them, it will be meaningless. The little guy doesn't even know how powerful these two guys are. The effect of its attack will be greatly reduced. If he wanted others to be grateful, he had to help them at their most dangerous and most helpless moment. There was no need for anyone to teach him such a simple principle. He was still confident that he could stop the irreversible danger before it happened, but he couldn't guarantee that it could still continue its current weak and wretched demon setting. How to reach out his hand at the right time without letting the little fellow realize his intentions. This was a difficult problem, and he needed to improvise. Lu Xiaoyi had long since discovered this sneaky void beast. He relied on the perception of the sword light that he had placed outside. In a different environment, he wouldn't be interested in a void beast that was common in the universe. However, things were different now. He had been competing with Fei Fei for almost 2 years in this kind of environment, but the monster was still the same. This aroused his competitive spirit. Now that a void beast had appeared in this area, there was definitely a problem. All beasts had their own territorial awareness. This was the nature of beasts. Even ordinary beasts were like this, let alone these creatures of the universe. Humans looked at these void beasts wandering around the universe as if they were unrestrained and free. In fact, they were all moving around in their own territory. It was just that the range of their activities was large enough that humans couldn't observe them all. For example, in the position of the Changshuo relay point, because of a beast tide that was rushing towards the main world, the void beasts in the surrounding area were basically all wiped out. There weren't any left, and the vacuum formed needed time to fill. Filling it wasn't a one-time thing, but a process. This was because every void beast would leave their own unique aura in their own territory, and it could be maintained for a long time. Ordinary beasts peed and scratched. Void beasts had their own unique ways. When the surrounding void beasts saw that their neighbors weren't at home for a long time, they would slowly infiltrate. They would stand, look left and right, and then extend their legs. To infiltrate to the central area of the Changshuo relay point, this position needed a very long time, at least 10 years or more. Occasionally, there would be great demons that would fly into this area. They would definitely be at least at the level of a true monarch. They were real dragons that crossed the river. If a small character like the Yuanying void beast rashly barged in, they would die. Therefore, Tian Air's method that he thought was foolproof was wrong. This was because he didn't know that a beast tide had occurred in this area. When Lu Xiaoyi sensed it for the first time, he knew that something was wrong. However, he didn't discover Tian Air, who was hiding among them. This was in line with the monster Fei's expectation of waiting for its companions to arrive. Wasn't one yuan beast a little too little? Or was it just a vanguard? He decided to give Fei a warning. At least, he had to let it know that it wasn't that he didn't dare to attack the void beasts, but that he was afraid of trouble. If Fei was a monkey, he decided to kill a chicken to show it. Why not just kill the monkey directly? He actually didn't completely understand his own mentality. How to kill a chicken. He decided to give Fei something that would shock him. It wasn't something that would cause the weather to change or the sun and moon to dim. He had long since stopped pursuing such superficial things. The real shock should be psychological. For example, when Fei saw the fellow clansman that slid over, it was no longer a lively fellow clansman, but a dead creature that had been stabbed to death by a flying sword. What would it think? Would it leave without saying goodbye? He also wanted to launch a sneak attack, and it had to be a perfect sneak attack. The sneak attack would kill the yuan beast, and Fei wouldn't be able to sense it. This was very difficult, because Fei would be able to sense it as soon as he drew his sword. However, he had a better method. Under his control, a flying sword that was roaming outside and responsible for sensing approached the yuan beast openly. Tian didn't think much of this flying sword. He had some understanding of the swordsman's methods. He knew that this kind of sword light could only be used for sensing. It couldn't hurt the enemy because it didn't have a source of energy. This kind of sword light could only rely on its weak magic power to maintain its roaming outside, but it couldn't injure the enemy. This was the swordsman's principle when using their swords. No one would let a fully charged flying sword do the job of a sentry. Of course, Lu Xiaoyi wouldn't do that either. However, he had the ability to restore the flying sword to full health in an instant. The sword light quietly passed under the yuan beast. At this moment, the few stars in this area of the negative space suddenly dimmed. It was as if countless light bulbs had been connected to a certain high-power device. The sudden activation caused the voltage to be too low and caused the lights to flicker. The high-power device was the sword light. The light bulbs were the countless stars. The flying sword suddenly trembled. In a short moment, it pierced through the yuan beast's lower jaw. Chapter 1064. The three people and one beast all felt that something was wrong. Tian felt that something was wrong. Because if this was a sneak attack, why did the flying sword leave its scabbard immediately? Fatty D felt that something was wrong. Because this little guy's attack had actually deceived it. If it was in cahoots with the yuan beast at such a close distance, it would not even have time to react. Lu Xiaoyi felt that something was wrong. Because when the flying sword shot into the yuan beast's mouth, it seemed to have entered another body. It was not the yuan void beast body. His reaction was extremely fast, and he immediately realized something. Although this sword light accurately hit the opponent, it also caused damage. After all, it was the power of the stars across space and could not display its full strength. The damage was limited. With his rich battle experience, he did not hesitate to burst out tens of thousands of sword lights. At this time, he did not care to shock Fatty because he found that he had the wrong target. It was not a void beast. It was a human cultivator. Not killing in one blow was a great taboo. The most important thing now was to deal the final blow. Therefore, he burst out with all his strength and did not give the cultivator hiding in the beast's mouth time to recover. There was no need to mention Tian. He did not feel that something was amiss, but something was completely wrong. This was because the flying sword had drilled into his abdomen without him being prepared. The power of the Tao realm erupted instantly. Even a true lord with such a strong body could not withstand it. The difference between a yuan beast and a true monarch was not in the body, but in the mind. This sudden sword strike immediately scattered all of his preparations. The offensive Tao artifact that was right beside his hand could not be activated. As for the combined spell technique, it had failed to accumulate enough power. He lost the support of his magic power for teleportation. The entire Tao technique system fell into a short period of chaos. But fortunately, he was a beast tamer. Although he could not release other things, he could still release his life's source soul, the void beast. In the face of this sudden attack, he could not care about anything else. Whatever mission, whatever goal, he had to survive first. Releasing two void beasts was the trump card of a beast tamer cultivator. For humans, controlling void beasts was usually done by suppressing one's realm. For example, he was a true monarch. Controlling the Yuaniing void beast was the most suitable. He did not need to worry about the rebellious void beast backlash. For example, the one he was hiding in his body. But if he wanted to display his might in battle, he needed an offensive spirit like the void beast. It was the combination of his own source spirit and a true monarch-level void beast. It had the body of a true monarch void beast and the soul essence of a human cultivator. It was powerful, loyal, and unafraid of death. It was a true offensive weapon. He had two of these origin spirit void beasts, and in times of crisis, he had released both of them. Now was not the time to hide. He needed time to recover his bodily functions slightly before he could think of counterattack. At the same time, he also needed to warn his companions behind him. Face was worthless now, even if he owed the other party a favor. Even if the other party didn't pay him a single cent, he couldn't force himself. However, the swordsman did not give him the time to do so. A moment ago, that sly sword light had just entered his body, but the next moment, the overwhelming sword light followed him like a shadow. It was so fast that he had just released the two void beasts, but he did not even have time to add a layer of defense to himself. The two void beasts could only change from attacking to defending, baring their fangs and brandishing their claws to help block the dense rain of sword light. The sword light division played a huge role in this moment. The two void beasts' individual defense was very strong, but they could not block the pervasive sword light. Even if they waved their claws and tails like windmills, how could they defend against an all-around three-dimensional attack? Under the attack of several tens of thousands of sword light, the two void beasts barely blocked most of them. However, there were still tens of thousands of sword light that entered the mouth of the already dead Yuaniing void beast, leaving countless holes in Tian Air's body. His body that had just improved immediately deteriorated. He could only rely on his profound Tao realm strength to support himself. But how long he could support himself like this was no longer up to him. It was up to his companions behind him to support him. This was an incomparably sullen sneak attack. Not only did the sneak attack not succeed, but he was also sneak attacked. Even now, he could not leave the death void beast's large mouth. He could clearly see that there was no advantage in forcefully jumping out. He was as slow as a snail under the flying sword. If he stayed in the beast's mouth, he could at least rely on the dead beast's body to weaken the flying sword's strength. In his current situation, after releasing the two void beasts, he no longer had any room to struggle. This was a battle. This was a sneak attack. Once he was hit, his body would be ravaged by the opponent's Tao realm strength, and he could only wait to be captured. And this was what he was originally good at. Why hadn't Tiani come yet? Although the two of them were very far apart, once the battle broke out at full speed, it would still take a few breaths of time to arrive. Was there a need to dawdle like this? Did he not want to come? Or did he not want to come? Tian Air felt that this hunting mission was a little too blind. He had completely believed the news of his client, but he had not done his own investigation. This was a big taboo for assassins. Unfortunately, there was no turning back. Tian, he wanted to rush out at the first moment. As an assassin, he did not lack decisiveness. Although he despised that idiot for being so passive when dealing with a Yuaniing, he would not leave him alone just because he despised him. He had experienced too much, and he was all too clear that now was the time for sincere cooperation, not scheming against each other and taking all the credit for himself. The reason why assassin organizations paid their members in small teams was to prevent those who cooperated with each other from having selfish motives. If the mission failed, everyone would be humiliated. To Tian E, he thought even further. The inexplicable battle had made him smell something unusual. At this moment, helping a comrade was helping himself. Even if that idiot made him very dissatisfied. As he rushed out, he lit a white colt lantern for himself. This was a unique skill of his. Once this lantern was lit, one's primordial spirit would be illuminated. This was an extremely profound method of protecting and supplementing one's primordial spirit. When the lantern was lit, one's primordial spirit would be clear, and one's primordial spirit would be clear. The primordial spirit mentioned here was not just a general term. It really had a practical use, especially for fast-moving attacks like the flying sword. Once the lantern was lit, the sword's primordial spirit would be in the primordial spirit's primordial spirit. Simply put, it was a profound Tao realm of time. It could analyze the opponent's attack path frame by frame, just like a slow-motion picture. The Tao realm was attached to it, and the intent was pointed out. Foreseeing the enemy, attacking the enemy was essential. White colt, it was derived from the meaning of a white colt passing through a crack. Once the opponent attacked, he would be able to instantly understand the opponent's intent. As one of the top-ranked assassins in the assassin organization, he had not relied on luck to achieve his current status. It was based on his true abilities. Every time he faced a strong enemy, as long as he lit this white colt lantern, he would be able to capture them easily. No matter how cunning or strong the opponent was, under his perfect preemptive judgment, they would all be obediently beheaded in the end. He had a premonition that no matter how strong that Yuan Ying's opponent was, there would be a limit. He would not be able to surpass a perfected lording master. However, to be able to beat Tian Yi to such a state, he would definitely be a quick-witted person who was adept at fighting for supremacy. Such a person, moreover, was a swordsman. Ordinary cultivators would not be able to keep up with his pace at all. Their brains might not even be as fast as a sword, and defeat would often result from this. By lighting this white colt lantern, he would be able to completely wipe away the opponent's advantage. At that time, with his primordial spirit perfected Lord strength, what kind of tricks would he be afraid of? He would not even be able to escape. Chapter 1065. Tian Yi had just leaped out when he suddenly stopped, because the lamp was not lit. What was going on? It shouldn't be. It was impossible. A lamp that had been lit for thousands of years was like a smoker. How could there be a mistake in lighting a cigarette? That was something that could be lit subconsciously with one's eyes closed. Something was definitely wrong. In the cultivation world, it was said that foundation establishment cultivators could not release their spells in a moment of nervousness. However, such a situation was impossible in Jindan, not to mention Yuanying. When it came to him, a 1,000-year-old essence soul-perfected cultivator, it was like wine not being poured into the mouth, but going into the nose instead. His heart shrank. Under such circumstances, he knew that there was a reason for this. He could only quickly scan the surrounding space with his divine sense. There was nothing. His companion was in danger. He could not spend too much time investigating the reason. He could only grit his teeth and light again. This time, it was not like the previous time where he instinctively lit the lamp. Instead, it was like 1,000 years ago when he first learned this technique. The process of lighting the white lamp was not simple. It was complicated and required the combination of 10 different techniques. He had long been able to complete it in an instant. However, now, he was back to the situation of performing it step by step, gathering the spell, splitting the force, crossing the bridge, guiding the spirit, seizing the eyes, clearing the soul, twisting the candle, forming the stamen. Finally, time and Tao realm fused together. The white lamp that should have lit up at his Naiwan palace only produced a few small sparks. It struggled a few times, but did not move at all. He was an orthodox Taoist cultivator. Among the top teachers in his country, there were also half-immortals. He was very knowledgeable. Although the teachers did not know that he had secretly done this or pretended not to know, he still cared about his reputation. He bowed deeply to the void and apologized. This junior was rash. As the saying goes, those who do not know are not to blame. This junior thanks senior for not killing me. This junior will return to heaven's choice and withdraw from heavenly assassins. I will not say a word about what happened today. Once he finished speaking, he turned and left. Although he flew calmly, his heart was still very nervous. He knew that he had taken a trip around the gates of hell. He was really lucky. Only after flying for 3 days did he light the white lamp again. In an instant, the lamp was as bright as day. There was not a trace of abnormality. He let out a long sigh and immediately left. He felt that it was a pity. That Tion Air's luck was really bad. How could he have drawn the first lot? Far away, Fatty D heaved a sigh of relief. The mystical technique of a human cultivator was not something that it could easily deal with. The realm of an essence soul-perfected lord was not far from it, only 2 realms away. Furthermore, it was an orthodox Taoist. If it were to let him light up the lantern technique, it would be difficult to extinguish it. Fortunately, as an immemorial sacred beast, he had a not-so-powerful divine ability. Ghost blow out the lamp. Just in time, it had to make a move. That was because this essence soul-perfected lord was not someone the little fellow could deal with right now. The difference was too great. Especially when the white colt's lantern was used, the little guy's Bezor and Gobao were completely useless against it. He couldn't even bring out the swordsman's unique traits and had no means of resisting. To deal with such an essence soul perfected lord, one had to be at least an upper-level perfected lord at the very least. Only then would one be able to fight against an essence soul perfected lord on the psyche level and the Tao realm. Only then would one be able to fight against time. Swordsmen emphasized actual combat, but they had to differentiate between the types of actual combat. If it was just a one-sided beating, then it was completely meaningless. When it made its move, the little fellow would definitely work hard on the Tao of Time when he returned. However, the problem was that his current realm was not at the stage where he could come into contact with the Tao of Time. It couldn't change a cultivator's cultivation plan just because of one exception. From what it knew, there were very few cultivators who could understand the Tao of Time to a certain extent in the perfected Lord realm. They were so rare that they were as rare as phoenix feathers and unicorn horns. There was no need to target them. There were 36 connate Taos, and each Taos had their own peerless talents. If they had to target such a strong opponent every time they encountered one, would they be able to? This was considered from the perspective of cultivation techniques. In addition, considering the current situation of Heaven's Choice, it was not good to kill them all. There were countless great cultivators of Heaven's Choice. Some orthodoxies and countries were very protective of their own. If this went on endlessly, even a half-immortal like Fatty D might not be able to protect them all. Leaving one person, leaving a suspense, leaving a taboo, often made people even more fearful. The only downside of doing this was that it couldn't act as a savior in front of the little fellow. It also couldn't quickly get closer to him. However, after 2 years, it also understood some things. Had he been too hasty? Was it too focused on leaving behind traces? The friendship between cultivators needed a long time to settle. There was no such thing as a lifelong relationship with a glance. The heavens were already very kind to it. It survived, and now it saw a glimmer of hope. It should be satisfied. As an immemorial sacred beast, it had an endless life to wait. If the little fellow was really the root it imagined, it would be natural for it to come up. Then, what was there to be regretful about? The first time they met, it was enough to leave a general impression. Since there was a beginning, why worry about the future? Of the 2 perfected lords, it scared one away, and the little fellow tortured the other. This was really a good move. It was really too cunning, too bad, too ruthless. It was just like its thigh in the past, meticulous and ruthless. He was probably still on guard against this strange monster. It must be so. Otherwise, it wouldn't have set up such a tight defense around it. If that was the case, it really couldn't push it too hard. Things would only move in the opposite direction when they reached an extreme, and it would only ruin their impression of each other. A ball of Tao disappearing heavenly phenomenon bloomed in the void. Lu Xiaoyi didn't feel the changes in the distance. After all, His cultivation level was still too low. Not to mention a half-immortal, even a primordial soul-perfected lord, was an existence he had to look up to. He was trying to figure out the origins of this fellow. He was unclear, but there was one thing he was sure of. This fellow had been wandering around the area and only suddenly distanced himself when he attacked. This was a normal reaction. It would be abnormal if there was no reaction at all. This person approached him with ulterior motives. To put it bluntly, it was related to Heaven's choice, Taoist Huang. The death of Tin Yuanying was not a small grudge to any power. There was no reason to let it go so easily. He was confused by the small change in front of him and forgot the most important thing to guard against. The battle was a little lucky. Both sides wanted to launch a sneak attack. The key was his unpredictable sword, which decided the direction of the entire battle. Lu Xiaoyi was very clear that if they were to fight fair and square, he might not be able to win. Of course, he could fight and escape at the same time. This perfected lord hid in the beast's mouth and didn't appear from the beginning. He was seriously injured, but he still managed to withstand 10 breaths of direct attacks. If they were to really fight, just this tenacity alone was enough to make people afraid. This was the power of the Tao realm, a Tao realm more profound than his. He had to restrain himself. He secretly warned himself. When cultivators reached the perfected lord level, those who were good at fighting and came from big clans actually had strength that couldn't be underestimated. They couldn't be challenged casually. Chapter 1066. The man and beast acted as if nothing had happened, not saying a word about the human true monarch's attack. After a few days, Lu Xiaoyi, who felt bored, decided to return to the main world. He sent an invitation to this strange fatty. "I'm going back for a while. Want to come with me?" Fatty shook his head. "If I'm alone, I won't go. It's too dangerous." Lu Xiaoyi did not insist and left. When he reached the Changshuo region, everything was still calm and there was no news of the void beasts approaching. The only regret was that the old Taoist Kong Gu had not returned. Was he too far away? This matter could not be discussed with others. Fortunately, the old Taoist had already made arrangements for Laojun Temple. Everything was in order and there was nothing to worry about. Since the anti-space void beasts did not appear in Changshua's airspace, it was impossible for them to gather and return. They would scatter into the void of the origin world, like a small stream flowing into the ocean. It would not change anything. There was only one thing for sure. They could not return to the negative space. Lu Xiaoyi was bored and returned to the negative space again. What surprised him was that the monster did not leave and was waiting for him. Why? He was not a beast tamer and did not need void beasts to follow him. He was too lazy to care about it, just like how the monster wandered around without saying anything. There were 100 humans and 100 demons. There were 100 demons and 100 of them. There would always be some with a special personality that was closer to humans. That was not impossible. He still kept his security tight because he did not know if the revenge from Heaven's choice would come again. This was the consequence of offending the natives. However, he did not wait for the next wave of people from Heaven's choice. Instead, he waited for someone from the free and unfettered sect to replace him. "I'm here to replace Junior Brother under the orders of the sect. This is the certificate and the new mission given to you by the sect." The person who came was not unfamiliar, but also not familiar. There were thousands of Yuanying in the free and unfettered sect, and their circle was not small. This Senior Brother Wang was an experienced Yuanying in the late stage. In fact, Senior Brother Wang and Senior Brother Ko were the ones guarding the road signs. Lu Xiaoyi took the license and verified it. He also saw the new mission. His expression didn't change. They were all from the same sect after all. There were some things that needed to be explained clearly. Senior Brother Wang, since this is the sect's arrangement, Junior Brother will naturally follow it. However, during the 30 years that I have been guarding this place, some situations have occurred. I need to inform Senior Brother so that we can prepare in advance. It's like this. Senior Brother Wang was speechless when he heard this. In an instant, what was supposed to be a safe and lonely mission had turned into a risky business. Of course, he wouldn't blame him. Yuanning cultivators still had a sense of responsibility. You mean 12 Yuanning? A true monarch? Junior brother, you sure are ruthless. Lu Xiaoyi said bitterly. It's also intermittent. It's a free combination of factors and a bit of luck. Senior brother, I'm still not sure if they're targeting me or the guardian of the road sign. In my opinion, it was more likely that they were targeting me alone. Maybe if it was someone else, it wouldn't have happened. But you still have to be careful. Being alone in the negative space, there's no helper. The true monarchs of Changshuo are also not in the domain. How to guard this place, senior brother understands. Senior brother Wang nodded. Guarding the road sign in the negative space was not the first time he had disputes with the cultivators of the Heaven's Choice continent. He had his own set of coping mechanisms. After all, the cultivators of the two worlds still prioritized restraint in their interactions with each other. After the two finished the exchange, Lu Xiaoyi took out the ferry and floated away. He received a new mission. It was still unclear who had given him the mission. It didn't mean that he could return to Zhouxian. Instead, he had to rush to the next relay point in the negative space, the Taigu relay point. The mission sounded very simple. It was to deliver a jade slip to the largest Taoist force in the Taiga domain. It was more like a diplomatic mission that happened to coincide with the 10,000-year celebration of the establishment of the force. Judging from the position of the universe, the Changshuo domain was probably far away from the 5 universes of the upper realm of Zhouxian. This Taiga domain was even further away, surpassing the 8 universes. From the description of the mission, there were no cultivators guarding the Taiga relay point because it did not belong to the public road sign system of the upper realm of Zhouxian. It was Xiaoyaoyu's private road sign. This situation was very common in the 9 great sects of Zhouxian. The main road sign system was the public road sign system that was guarded by cultivators. Then, scattered all around were the 9 great sect space transition points that were discovered by themselves. Just like the sword vein support to Tiger Hill, it was a yellow quartz sect's private road sign. In other words, the Taoist force in the Taiga domain might not be a friend of Zhouxian, but it must be a friend of Xiaoyaoyu. When a friend had a happy occasion, it was necessary to send someone to congratulate them and send a gift. Lu Xiaoyi did not see any gifts. He thought that they were all in the jade slip that he could not see through. He just needed to send it over. It was an easy task on the way. It was also because of this mission that Senior Brother Wang gave him the key to the Taiga relay point. In his anti-space ferry raft, according to his current authority, he could see 3 points: Zhouxian, Changshuo, and Taigu. Of course, if he used the key authority that he had researched carefully, he could actually see 13 points, including the Taigu relay point. Although he could see a lot of relay points, the problem was that he did not know which point corresponded to which main world's domain, which was the public system, and which was the private road sign of each sect. His current direction was getting further and further away from Zhouxian, but that was not necessarily the case. It could even be said that it was basically impossible for him to be on the right path back to the 5th ring road. And this was the real reason why he was so busy in the anti-space. The void beast called Fatty did not follow him. Although it felt that this thing was very strange, it was not in the mood to continue to explore. In this cultivation world, everyone, every void beast, and every creature had their own secrets. Just like how it looked at others strangely, others also looked at him strangely. For example, Xia Bingji, Ka Wa, Inya, Slug, and even his shadow, Shaking Swordsman Brothers. Which one of them did not look at him strangely? In the past 30 years of guarding the Waymark, there was a series of intermittent situations. Smugglers, Heaven's chosen people, beast-tide, and assassins. There did not seem to be anything particularly noteworthy. The only thing that was not clear was the secret of the Wuhou country that Taoist Huang belonged to. They had entered the main world in an organized manner. But where did they go? What was their purpose? The only gain was that he had a deep understanding of Zhou Xian's Waymark system. This would allow him to enter the anti-space in the future without worrying about not being able to find the exit. He met 2 people, but they could not be considered friends. One was Huang Nian, a terrible beast tamer swordsman. The other was Fatty, a strange void beast. The only one that could be considered a friend was the old Taoist Kongu, but he still did not know where he had gone. The affairs of the world were hard to predict. Chapter 1067. This distance took him close to half a year. There were no accidents. In fact, an accident in the reverse space would be an accident. The Taiga waymark was still disguised as a meteorite. In such an environment, there was only one choice. It was like pretending to be a grain of sand on the beach if you didn't want to attract attention. Wouldn't it be stupid to pretend to be a tree? He adjusted his secret key to the highest level and found 7 new light spots near the Taiga waymark. This meant that there were 7 new entrances. It was as dense as a web. It was impossible to find the way home with pure deduction ability. Zhou Xian had a history of hundreds of thousands of years. How many entrances could the 9 great sects find in such a long time? Lu Xiaoyi circled around the waymark and observed for a while. Without hesitation, he started to gather energy and began to break through the wall. He arrived at the main world and made a judgment. There was a faint aura of spiritual vigor coming from a star in a certain direction. It was here, in the void of the universe. The cultivation star field was as dazzling and eye-catching as a pearl. He slowly approached it. In the universe, seeing a star and flying to it were 2 different concepts. For a weak realm like Changshuo, they wouldn't care about placing the space transition point very close. However, in a high-class realm like the Taiga waymark, people couldn't sleep soundly next to their beds. Lu Xiaoyi appeared in the main world, but it was actually quite far from the Taiga waymark. It was so far that he flew for half a month before gradually approaching it. It was during this process that he was targeted by the cultivators of the Taiga waymark. It was a problem to distinguish one's identity when traveling through the void. The universe was boundless, and it was impossible to distinguish one's identity at a glance. Therefore, it was based on the realms. Every realm's cultivators had the responsibility to send out inquiries to unfamiliar cultivators outside their own realm. The closer the distance, the more frequent the inquiries. If there was no unique aura of the realm, they could basically confirm the outsider's identity and then respond with a series of responses. Lu Xiaoyi now had the unique aura of the upper realm of Zhou Xian. He didn't even have the aura of the 5 rings or the blue sky realm. As soon as he approached the Taiga waymark, he was immediately discovered by the cultivators. 2 Yuaning came around and faintly caught him. However, their attitude was still gentle. They didn't shout to kill him. "Where are you from? Where are you going? There's a boundary in front. Please take a detour." Lu Xiaoyi tucked his tail between his legs and said politely, "The Tao sect of the universe is one family, and I am a messenger." The first time he came to Taigu, he came to look for the Dragon Gate ceremony. "If you have the time, I'd like to trouble you 2 fellow Taoists to give me some pointers." The 2 Yuaning were dressed in Taoist attire, which could not be faked in their own domain's airspace. Once they heard these words, they understood. Recently, the largest Taoist sect in the Taiga domain, the Dragon Gate sect, was holding their 10,000-year establishment ceremony. Needless to say, within the domain, many people had come to congratulate them. The Dragon Gate sect was a large force and had many friends in the universe. It was not uncommon for guests from other domains to travel thousands of miles to congratulate them on the orders of the sect. They had only sent a Yuanian cultivator. Presumably, the scale of this force was very limited in this realm. Although this was what they thought, it was not good to offend them. This kind of matter involved many things. For a small force like theirs, if the Yuaniing were to teach others their shortcomings, they would directly offend the Dragon Gate sect. Of course, they couldn't be biased. It was better to have concrete evidence. One of the cultivators smiled and said, "If that's the case, please follow us. I know where a few senior brothers from the Dragon Gate are active. It's only right that they bring you into the domain." Lu Xiaoyi followed the host's wishes, and the atmosphere between the 2 parties was still quite harmonious. After all, it was just a Yuanian cultivator. How much damage could he cause to a domain? In a small celestial phenomenon, an olding was teaching 2 novices how to find and harvest spiritual opportunity when he was directly called out. Lu Xiaoyi didn't say much and handed over his xiaoyao knot. At the late stage of yuanying, he was considered a person with a high status in a sect. He had some understanding of his sect's allies in the universe. When he saw the xiaoyao knot, he immediately knew that they had come to a distant and powerful domain. Its strength was far above that of the Taiga sect. Although he didn't know why they only sent a yuanying cultivator over such a long distance, he didn't dare to be negligent. He instructed the two novices to take care of themselves while he led Lu Xiaoyi to the domain. He said coldly, "Fellow Taoist Dan, you've come from a place far away, and the inverse space is lonely. Has your journey been smooth?" Lu Xiaoyi replied, "It can be considered smooth. The universe is different now. The main world is chaotic, and the inverse space isn't much better. It's just that there are fewer people, and it's more spacious." The olding sighed. "It's the same everywhere. It's the same in the void of the universe, and it's the same in the domain. The great Tao has collapsed, and everyone is in a state of panic, unable to continue." The Dragon Gate's Millennium Ceremony originally didn't have the intention to create such an image, but under the general situation, various methods are needed to boost the cohesion. Lu Xiaoyi expressed his understanding. The two of them traveled together in silence. Not long after, they saw a huge star field. In Lu Xiaoyi's opinion, it was similar to the blue sky and could be considered a large domain. Outside the domain, a macro membrane appeared faintly, containing a supreme power. He estimated that if he were to crash into it with his current strength, he would probably end up with a head full of bumps. This kind of defense couldn't be used as a trick to get through. "There's a breach." The old Ing apologized. He pulled Lu Xiaoyi's hand and crashed into the macro membrane. The two of them passed through the membrane and crossed the clouds. A picturesque scene of mountains and rivers appeared before their eyes. However, to Lu Xiaoyi, who had experienced the five rings, the blue sky, and Zhou Xian, this kind of scenery could no longer move him. The two of them flew toward the mountain range. Pavilions could be faintly seen in the mountain range. They were scattered about in picturesque disorder. It was a very authentic celestial atmosphere, but to the experienced and knowledgeable Lu Xiaoyi, it was still a common sight. After entering the Dragon Gate, the olding handed him over to another yuanying and left. This yuanying was a taciturn person. He didn't talk much and just led the way. Not long after, they were brought to a big hall. The name of the hall was very elegant, the Hall of Quiet Peace. Not long after, a true monarch walked into the hall with a smile on his face. He looked very approachable. The reception in the cultivation world was very particular about the principle of equality. Soldiers faced soldiers, generals faced generals. The reason why a true monarch came out was because of the domain behind Lu Xiaoyi. A backer was always the most important factor. If he came down from the mortal court, all the top cultivators of the Dragon Gate would probably line up to welcome him. The cultivation world was also a world of favors. "I'm Mo Gu, the Hall Master of the Hall of Quiet Peace. Since you're from Zhou Xian, you're one of us. There's no need to be restrained here. Just treat it as if you're free and unfettered." Lu Xiaoyi bowed deeply. "I'm Shan Er. I've come to the Dragon Gate to observe the ceremony under the orders of my master. I also have a jade scroll for you to take a look at." True monarch Mo Gu took the jade scroll and opened it with a special method. After scanning it with his divine sense, he roughly understood what was going on. Chapter 1068. Mo Gu smiled and carefully looked at the Yuanying Jr. in front of him. He thought about how to start the conversation, but after thinking about it, he felt that it was best to be straightforward. This was also in line with the swordsman's character. Since he wanted to use someone else, he shouldn't beat around the bush and make it seem like he was playing tricks. "Little friend Dan, you may not know this, but the reason why your sect sent you here is to borrow your strength. These words are all in the jade slip. You can take a look and see for yourself if it's true." As he spoke, he removed the other irrelevant words from the jade slip, leaving only the words related to the swordsman, and handed it back. Lu Xiaoyi scanned the jade slip with his spiritual sense. It was clearly written on the jade slip. Carefree disciple is hereby ordered to go to the Supreme Valley Dragon Gate. As long as it doesn't affect the sect and his own safety, he must listen to the orders of the elders of the Dragon Gate. He finally understood why he didn't need to bring any gifts to attend the ceremony. He was a gift himself. He said helplessly, "Disciple is a rough person. Usually I can fight and get into trouble, but I don't know anything else. My knowledge is limited and I don't know much." Mo laughed. "Little friend Dan, you're too polite. As cultivators, if we can fight, what's the point of everything else? This time, we want to borrow your strength to fight the swordsman. I hope you won't have any objections." What could Lu Xiaoyi say? It was Carefree's order. He had no one to blame but himself. Of course, he wasn't afraid of fighting, especially with an organization. In this kind of situation, he wouldn't encounter any monarchs, so there was basically no danger. "Since I'm here, I'll do my best to contribute to the friendship between the two sects according to the orders of my sect. However, I'd like to ask you to tell me about the origins and rules so that I can be mentally prepared." Mo smiled and explained, "The immemorial cultivation world is a world of cultivators with a clear distinction. The so-called clear distinction means that Taoism and Buddhism are on opposite sides. They can't tolerate each other, and neither can do anything to the other. In the universe, it's quite rare." Lu Xiaoyi nodded. He knew what Monarch Mogo meant. In fact, what he meant was that if the world of cultivation wanted to develop steadily, the most impossible situation was for two forces to be evenly matched, because this meant that they were sworn enemies. For example, the 5 rings were a tripartite balance of power. Zhou Xian stood with 9 legs, 7 Taoists, and 2 Buddhas. The strong and the weak were clearly distinguished. Changshuo was the dominant force. A special environment and a special history were needed for the two to exist side by side. He would slowly understand these things in the future. Mo sighed. The history is a long story, so I won't go into too much detail here. I'll just talk about the influence of the environment on the confrontation between these forces. Taiga's position in this part of the universe was very special. There were 4 stars shining around him, and under the influence of the 4 stars, the earth veins in his body began to mutate, resulting in the extremely rare 4 seasons. Simply put, in the direction of the 4 stars in Taigu, there are 4 completely opposite climates. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter do not change with time, but are fixed in the 4 directions. For example, the land where our Dragon's Gate sect is located is illuminated by the spring star, and the land's climate is eternal spring. The land in the other directions is summer, autumn, and winter. It's a straight line that separates them clearly, and it's also a miracle of nature. Ever since Lu Xiaoyi approached the Taiga domain, he had always felt strange. He had just arrived, so of course he could not experience this natural change where time was almost stagnant, but it was as if he was not interested in everything. So this was the reason. It seemed to be contrary to the laws of nature. A region had 4 seasons, for seasons, hot and cold, day and night, and the changes of yin and yang. This was the most in line with the laws of nature, right? It could be understood that the entire region was forever frozen, or it could be as hot as fire. However, a region was forcibly divided into 4 continents: spring, summer, autumn, and winter. The seasons of each continent would never change. No matter how he thought about it, it felt strange. How did crops grow? How did humans adapt? How did rain clouds form? How did rivers form? It didn't conform to the laws of nature. The humans who lived here didn't have to wear clothes. Those who lived in the winter continent would always wear a fur coat, while those who lived in the summer continent would simply be bare-chested for the rest of their lives. However, in the world of cultivation, there was never a lack of peculiarities. All kinds of celestial bodies existed. At least, there were still 4 seasons here. It was just that it was fixed on the continents and would never change. In his opinion, such an environment might not be good for a cultivator's enlightenment because of the lack of change. However, on the other hand, it would allow one to specialize in certain directions. Since the Taiga region had the existence of the grand membrane of heaven and earth, It at least showed that the cultivator's achievements in cultivation were not low. He was afraid that there were still many things that he couldn't see clearly. He, a small Yuanying, was here to criticize the continents that people had lived on for tens of thousands of years. He was overestimating himself. Mo Gu continued, "It is precisely because Taigu has 4 distinct seasons that for mortals, walking between continents is almost impossible. This is because after people have adapted to a certain temperature for decades, it is inevitable that diseases will breed when they have to accept a completely different climate. Taigu seems to be a region, but it is forcibly divided into 2 parts by the environment. Taoism occupies the spring and autumn continents, while Buddhism occupies the summer and winter continents. Because of this, the orthodoxy is isolated, because mortals don't flow to each other." Lu Xiaoyi smiled and said, "This is a strange thing. However, Taoism still has an advantage, right? After all, spring and autumn are close, but summer and winter are opposite." Emogu nodded and smiled. "That's the reason. Unfortunately, Taoism has not established an advantage over Buddhism for tens of thousands of years. This is the incompetence of cultivators of our generation. We are ashamed." Lu Xiaoyi was deeply touched. It's already good that they can maintain it. The ability of Buddhism to spread their beliefs is really terrifying. Mo Gu looked at him with appreciation. "My young friend, you have a deep understanding. You are right. Although we are in the same region, when it comes to the spread of orthodoxy, Taoism is far inferior. In Taigu, we reluctantly rely on the division of the 4 seasons to keep Buddhism's beliefs outside, but it is also difficult to do so. Originally, if there was no change in the Great Tao, this situation would have continued. However, the Great Tao collapsed and the rules were loosened. In Buddhism, there was a call to integrate the 4 seasons, believing that the real region should not be determined by the 4 seasons according to space, but should return to the essence, where the 4 seasons change according to time. Lu Xiaoyi somewhat understood. "Senior, to be honest, this idea is not without reason. The reason why Dragon Gate Taoism did not accept it is not because the 4 seasons belong to the sequence of time, but because they are worried that with the integration of the 4 seasons, Buddhism's beliefs will take the opportunity to invade and occupy Taoism's living space, right?" Emogu nodded bitterly. This junior's vision was very sharp, and he could often see through the essence of the matter at a glance. It seemed that the Yuanying sent by carefree travel this time was not as bad as his terrible cultivation. Chapter 1069. Emogu heaved a long sigh. How would you choose between passing down the orthodoxy and the orthodoxy? Buddhism wants to reset the 4 seasons in Taigu and gather the power of Buddhism and Taoism, taking advantage of the weakening of the heavenly Tao. At the same time, they will start to spread their faith. The collapse of the great Tao will take at least tens of thousands of years. The sooner the 4 seasons are reset, the better it will be for Buddhism. Because everyone is staring at the beginning of the new era, thinking that the strength of Buddhism and Taoism before the new era will affect the heavenly Tao's recognition of the strength of Buddhism and Taoism after the new era. The competition will be very intense. Lu Xiaoyi understood what Emogu meant. Just like the heavenly Tao of this universe's cultivation world, it tacitly acknowledged the fact that Taoism was stronger than Buddhism in the cultivation world and maintained such a pattern in the operation of the heavenly Tao. Just like the referee of competition, he had always tacitly acknowledged the rights of the strong teams, big clubs, and famous players while controlling the rights of the weak teams. If the weak teams wanted to turn the tables, they would have to put in more effort. This was not a fair environment, because the heavenly Tao recognized the strength of Taoism and the weakness of Buddhism in this world. In the current era, this situation could not be changed because the heavenly Tao had been fixed, but the gradual collapse of the great Tao and the rebirth of the new era gave Buddhism a chance. They had to do their best to develop and strengthen the Buddhist League before the end of the era. just so that the new heavenly Tao could balance the bowl of water more evenly when a new era was reborn. More directly, among the 36 innate great Taos, there should be more great Taos that lean towards Buddhism. It would be best if the number of great Taos could be equal to Taoism's innate great Taos. At least, they would not be completely crushed like now. This required the efforts of all Buddhist forces, every realm, every continent, every place where Buddhism and Taoism were fighting. They cannot place their hopes on Taoism's self-discipline. After millions of years, Taoism had already proven their rogue nature, greed and greed. We Taoism recognize the idea of resetting the four seasons. This is the trend and also the will of the heavenly Tao. Being responsible for the hundreds of millions of people in Taigu has always been the core idea of Taoism. But we need time. Taigu had already been in this state for hundreds of thousands of years. So why should he be in such a hurry for the last few thousand years? Our idea is to push back the reset of the four seasons as much as possible. This will give the mortals more time to prepare. The key is that the more time passes, the more the great path will collapse, and the weaker the control of the heavenly axiom will be. Our efforts to change the fundamental environment of the Taigu realm will be easier to succeed. Now, only 4 of the innate Taos had collapsed, which was only a small portion of the 36 Taos. Thus, their influence on the heavenly Taos was limited. The more he retreated, the easier it would be to avoid any deviation when resetting the 4 seasons. He didn't want to fail and bring harm to the natural environment of the domain. This is also the prudent action of us Taoists who bemoan the state of the universe and pity the fate of mankind. Lu Xiaoyi chuckled. Yes, it's best to wait until the last moment before the end of the era to reset the 4 seasons of the Taigu. That's the easiest way. Besides, the Buddhists don't have the time to spread their beliefs. Mo Gu laughed dryly. This junior always hit the nail on the head, mercilessly exposing the true purpose of the Taoists. What bemoan the state of the universe and pity the fate of mankind? What following the will of the heavens? The most important thing was to not let the Buddhists suppress the Taoists. This was what the Taoists valued the most. Everything else was just a fig leaf to hide their true purpose. Who asked the Buddhist beliefs to be so pervasive? If talents were to flow freely in the mortal world, how would the Taoists be able to resist the Buddhist methods in the mortal world? It was inevitable that their cities would be attacked. Thus, the Taoists and Buddhists had a huge disagreement on when to activate the super large-scale forbidden technique to reset the 4 seasons of the Taigu. Ever since the collapse of the Great Path of Merit, they had never stopped discussing this aspect. After the collapse of the Great Void, it directly developed into a confrontation with force. Of course, it's not a war, but a confrontation under the rules. The Buddhists wanted to use this to pressure the Taoists. If the first time didn't work, they would try again. They hoped that under continuous pressure, the Taoists would eventually choose to compromise. Lu Xiaoyi interrupted. A large-scale forbidden technique? Do we need the Buddhists to join forces? Mogu nodded. In theory, we don't need to. They can do it alone. But in the Taigu's current environment, how would the Taoists allow the Buddhists to come to the spring and autumn land to cast the forbidden technique? Similarly, the Buddhists would not allow the Taoists to go to the summer and winter land to cast the forbidden technique, so they could only work together. Changing the time of the 4 seasons of the world is a huge project. It requires many perfected sovereigns to cast it at the same time. It also requires a period of perseverance. So in the Taigu, to complete this goal, the Buddhists and the Buddhists have to work together. This is unavoidable. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. This was the cultivation world. Orthodoxy was the most important. Everything else had to stand aside. The Taoists were very selfish in this change. They placed the inheritance of their orthodoxy first, instead of giving their hundreds of millions of people a more natural environment. The Buddhists were not much stronger. They had their own selfish motives in their public works. If they really did it for the sake of the common people, Why didn't the Buddhists work hard to reset the four seasons in the taiga cultivation world's tens of thousands of years of history? Now that he thought about it, crying and shouting that it was for the common people was also hypocritical. Embark continued. What I want to talk about is the way the Buddhists and Taoists settle their disputes. Because the four seasons are separated, under the influence of the four stars, the boundary between the seasons forms a seasonal barrier. In the hundreds of thousands of years, this barrier has become wider and wider. The spiritual vigor within it is chaotic and not suitable for ordinary people to live in. It has already started to occupy the normal living space. In such a barrier, there are some intersections between the four seasons. The intersections between the two seasons are everywhere. There are four intersections between the three seasons, and they are also the most important intersections. Every few hundred years, the intersections between the three seasons will produce a season eye. It is the key to resetting the four seasons. The Buddhist idea is that the four season eyes will be fought over by the Buddhists and the Buddhists. When the four season eyes are completely controlled by one of the Buddhists, the resetting will be done according to this Buddhist idea. For example, this time when both sides enter the seasonal barrier and the Buddhists obtain the four season eyes, the resetting will begin immediately. The Taoists can't stop it. If the Taoists obtain one or a few season eyes, the resetting of the four seasons will be delayed according to the Taoist idea. Only after a few hundred years, when a new season eye is produced, will we fight over it. This is the way the battle will be fought. In order to not cause a large-scale armed melee and affect the Taigu's cultivation reserve, both sides will only send 4 cultivators to enter. They won't be allowed to win by numbers. Lu Xiaoyi's head hurt when he heard this. It was just a fight, yet they had to come up with so many tricks. It was like taking off one's pants to vent. He smiled and said, "With such rules, it seems like the Buddhists are at a disadvantage. According to the Buddhist idea, they must obtain all 4 season eyes, and the Taoists only need to obtain 1 to stop them. Speaking of which, when did the Buddhists become so dafa?" Chapter 1070. Mo snorted. Of course they have to suffer some losses. They were the ones who suggested it. Otherwise, why would the Taoists agree? But later, we found out that we were tricked by the Buddhists. According to our spies and the Buddhists, this is part of the Buddhist realm's plan to turn the situation around. For this reason, the Taiga Buddhists have received strong support from the nearby Buddhist realm. I heard that they sent several top Buddhist experts over just to succeed in this battle. Also, let me tell you, the season barrier is not something that can end with just 1 season eye. We have to face the competition of other monks who have season eyes. It's very dangerous, and we don't have enough confidence. Lu Xiaoyi did not hold back. I have a question. Why is it yuanying? The decisive factor in the Taigu cultivation realm is the perfected cultivator. Why is such an important decision handed over to yuanying? It seems a bit far-fetched to say that we don't want to expand our differences and create chaos. Emogu nodded. Yes, of course. Such a big matter should be decided by the perfected cultivator. Even the perfected cultivator would compete in the void of the universe. This is the normal way to resolve differences in the cultivation realm. But it's different in the Taigu cultivation realm. The battle for the season eyes is not a symbol, but something that is truly decisive for the resetting of the 4 seasons. Previously, the Buddhists and Taoists would keep 2 season eyes each. When new season eyes appear and the old ones fail, they would take 2 each. This is a voluntary action. Now, it's up to strength to compete. In the end, the 4 seasons barrier is just a barrier within the realm. It's not a cosmic phenomenon that can be done by cultivators without worrying about the consequences. This is our home. If our home is destroyed, no one will have a good life. We're all worried that if the perfected cultivator makes a move within the barrier, the damage caused will make the resetting of the 4 seasons more difficult and unpredictable. In view of the determination to reset the 4 seasons, in view of the fact that we have to obtain 4 new season eyes within the barrier and the uncontrollable consequences of the perfected cultivator making a move, we can only let the yuanying do it. There's nothing we can do about it. He looked at Lu Xiaoyi. The Dragon Gate's Millennium Celebration is real. It's also true that hundreds of years of Season Eyes will be reborn. It's just a coincidence. A few days ago, our Dragon Sex Patriarch and your White Sex Patriarch had talked about this battle. They were worried that the Yuanying Sex Patriarch would not be able to completely control the process of the battle because the Buddhist Sex Foreign Aid is mysterious and unpredictable. After some discussion, your sex ancestor agreed to send a Yuanying expert to help. That's why you're here. Little friend Dan, I've heard that Xiao Yao Yu's Yuanying has countless nascent souls, but your sex ancestor only sent you here. You could be said to be a true core confidant. Looks like this little friend's strength is hidden very deeply. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that they are as rare as phoenix feathers and Qilin horns. Lu Xiaoyi pursed his lips. Sure enough, it was the old man with white eyebrows who was pulling the strings behind the scenes. Ever since he and Qing Xian entered Zhou Xian, this old man had been using Yin force behind their backs. What core of his heart? Tong Tong had only met him twice, and the second time, he didn't even say a word. Tong Tong had left him to work hard in Xiaoyao, unwilling to give him any help at all. There was nothing he could do about it. He was under someone else's roof, so he had no choice but to lower his head. However, he was vigilant in his heart. The places that the old man with white eyebrows sent him were more and more inclined towards the front line of the conflict with the Buddhist sect. This actually meant something. Lu Xiaoyi felt that it was necessary for him to return to Zhou Xian and have a talk with this person in charge of Xiaoyao. He wanted to tell him that he had already understood his meaning and that he should stop endlessly sending him to the front line of the conflict with the Buddhist sect. External aid? Is it just me? Or is there someone else? Do we need to familiarize ourselves with each other? In addition, I need a specific map of the Four Seasons barrier, as well as information about the Buddhist sex cultivators, the Eye of the Season, and the specific changes in the environment within the barrier. The more detailed, the better. Lu Xiaoyi was arranged to stay in the Dragon Sex abode. It was a standalone residence with good food, drinks, and fun. There were also a few Jin Dan cultivators who were attentive to his well-being and frequently asked him to teach them about Dao techniques. How many Dao techniques would a sword maniac like him know? It was hard to say what he knew, and his knowledge in other aspects was also very poor. All his skills were focused on the sword, which was not easy. There were still a few years before the start of the fight and the birth of the Eye of the Season. Lu Xiaoyi certainly would not be idle. He was not willing to stay in the cultivation sect day after day. He was more willing to wander around and see the unique scenery, culture, and customs of the taiga domain. After staying in the negative space for decades, it was time for him to get familiar with the people. He did not let anyone accompany him. For such a relaxing trip, it was best to travel alone. The most taboo thing to do was to have a tour guide. The true meaning of traveling was to follow the wind and listen to the rain. The people of Taigu were still very simple. Perhaps it was related to the fact that Taigu was divided into 4 continents and could not move freely. The customs and habits of each continent converged, and there were few changes. In the 2 continents controlled by the Taoists, because the Taoists followed the philosophy of non-interference, the folk culture was very active and very trendy. For example, he was now in a city called Xianlu. The small city was holding a female music festival that was held once every few years. Female music was not an entertainment industry culture. In fact, it had nothing to do with music. The music here was a kind of poetry, just like how some domains were fond of poetry. It was just that the music here was more open, more unrestrained, and there were no requirements for rhythm or style. It was fine as long as it was pleasant to listen to and catchy. The so-called female musicians were beautiful women in the city who had gone through many rounds of selection, and finally the most outstanding ones were selected. The selection here was not only based on their appearance and figure, but also the beauty of their poems. However, the poems were not written by themselves, but by their fans who showed off their talents. Therefore, it was a competition in all aspects. Of course, in the end, it became a competition between the east and west of the city, the south and the north of the city. It was not a competition between the top courtesans and the top writers. It was more like a spontaneous community entertainment activity for the people. Of course, if the women were chosen, they would be pleasing to the eyes on the stage. If the strong men were chosen, it would lose the meaning of entertainment, and there would be no inspiration for the poetry. The women in each district were supported by the talents of each district. Of course, there were also those who took advantage of the situation and had a special liking for them. In the chaos, it was an entertainment that belonged to the people. There were no rewards, and there were not many benefits. It was a very pure competition. It was a very good way to adjust to the boredom of life. Lu Xiaoyi liked this kind of casual thing very much. The kindness and the laziness, the noise and the dullness. Therefore, he also squeezed into the crowd to watch. He watched the beautiful young women, Luoluo Dafa's every frown and smile. He watched the young men below the stage, racking their brains just for half a beautiful poem. He only watched and did not participate. It was also a kind of enjoyment to feel the feelings of youth in the midst of it. He held the countless specialties of the street in his hands and cheered along with the cheers of the crowd. He regretted that a woman he liked did not get chosen 900 years old. It was only after cultivating to this point that he began to miss the beauty of youth. The passing of youth, the passing of time. Chapter 1071. The joy lasted for a few days. As the number of women on the stage decreased, the mood of the audience became higher and higher. There were only 9 women left. Here, they would decide the final 3 winners. In fact, they were the last 3 winners of the square. These women were just the representatives of the square. A small part of their strength came from their beauty, and a large part of their strength came from the many scholars in the square. In Taigu, there was one thing that Lu Xiaoyi admired. The Taoists didn't completely turn everything under their rule into a pure cultivation system that focused on cultivation. They had a good balance. Cultivators had a step to progress. Scholars and businessmen had their own social status, which was not easy. Just for this point, Lu Xiaoyi was willing to help them maintain this system for a longer time, because he didn't dare to imagine what would become of such a beautiful world after adding Buddhist elements. At least, the pink skeletons wouldn't have such an opportunity anymore, right? Life would lose its original color. The 9 women were basically 16 years old. They were young and in the prime of their lives. They couldn't be said to be peerless beauties, but they had their own youthful aura, which made the crowd below go crazy. Now, it was no longer a competition of the beauty of the women, but a pure competition between the square. There was no reason for them to give in. Among the 9 people, only one was slightly embarrassed. She was very beautiful, but she was a little older, and her body was a little plump. In fact, she wasn't that much older, but there was a big difference between a 20-year-old woman and a group of 28-year-old girls. Plump wasn't bloated, it was just that the part that should be big was bigger. This was the representative of the official square in the city. For the noble families, their wives and concubines certainly couldn't participate in this kind of folk entertainment. This was a matter of face. Of course, it was impossible to send a maid or something, because it didn't represent the official square's lineage. Therefore, they found a widow who had just lost her husband. She had the status and appearance, but without support, she had to stand out and let people point at her. Things like this were purely dependent on one's mentality. If one thought that this was a game between neighbors, then one would naturally be able to let go. The more one let go, the more beautiful it would be. If one took all this as a humiliation, then one would be more restrained. The more restrained one was, the more petty one would be. It was a vicious cycle. The reason why she was able to reach this step was not because of how exquisite the prose was, but because of her identity as an official. She could not be eliminated prematurely. However, this was as far as they could go. The next step would be the real battle. It was the best opportunity for the commoners to ignore the nobles. Their face would end here. It was precisely because everyone understood the crux of the matter that at this stage, the 8 girls beside her all had countless poems to offer, but she had none. Firstly, There were originally very few people in the official district. Secondly, since she knew that she was destined to be eliminated, who would be willing to offer a poem to embarrass herself? Even the shills who had written the letter for her in the beginning had changed their names, and no one cared about whether she was embarrassed or not. This was a happy day. Of course, he had to enjoy himself to the fullest and not make things difficult for himself. No one felt that there was anything wrong with this. Choosing such a woman from the official district to participate in the competition meant that there was a certain result. There were still poems being offered continuously. Their targets were the 8 beautiful young girls. When there was a good poem, the host would even recite it loudly, winning waves of applause from below. It had to be said that the literary literacy of the people of Taigu was quite high. Whether a poem was good or bad, they did not need anyone to teach them. They had their own fair judgment. In the crowd, Lu Xiaoi, who did not attract the attention of others, sighed. Of course, it was not because he pitied her. After cultivating for more than 800 years, he had killed countless people. He had long since forgotten what a soft heart was. It was impossible for him to feel emotional just because of a small episode in the mortal world. What he saw was that in the depths of the woman's wide sleeves, against her snow-white wrist, there was a small string of faint Buddhist beads bracelet. The faith of Buddhism was so pervasive. When people were frustrated, they would immediately find sustenance. Because of it, he believed that this was not organized. Under the blockade of Taoism and the real isolation of the Four Seasons barrier, it was impossible for there to be an organized belief system. He was afraid that it was scattered and specious, like the seeds of a dandelion, floating with the wind and taking root immediately. It was impossible to guard against and impossible to eliminate. This was not the only case. There were countless of them. This was the deep reason why Taoism did not dare to reset the Four Seasons. How could there be a nirvana where everyone was happy? This was the reason why Buddhism was widespread in the mortal world. Even if Taoism had done its best in governing the mainland, and even gave up the right to treat Taoism as the only way to advance in the mainland, those who were watching the show were sincere. He could not control all the people who were frustrated and wanted to find sustenance, but at least he could control the one in front of him. He took a piece of rice paper that could be seen everywhere and thought about what he should copy from the limited memories of his previous life. In the last round, the topic of the poem was to praise the beauty of a woman. It was the simplest, most direct, and most to the point. It was just that in the taiga domain, the people were honest and sincere, simple and kind. The metaphors in their poems were all based on the plants and insects that were close to them in their daily lives. They had a rustic feel to them, but they were apt and lively. In such a literary atmosphere, it was not appropriate to copy the exquisite poems of his previous life. It seemed pretentious, and unnatural. If he wanted to copy, he could only copy. Unfortunately, he had never remembered a complete poem. Finally, the talents dried up and ran out of words. The snowflake-like poems from before gradually stopped. Every woman was given at least 10 poems. The old pedants picked those that used beautiful words, had profound meanings, and opened up new paths, and then recited them one by one. The louder the cheers that a woman received, the more likely that she would become one of the 3 winners. Only the slightly older woman, who was at a loss of what to do, was still standing on the stage, enduring the awkwardness, hoping that everything would end quickly. Fortunately, she did not come out empty-handed. After all, there was still a poem that had been delivered to her. One poem, compared to others, was not even a fraction, but to her, it had a different meaning. It was respect. It was acknowledgement. In the end, one of the old pedants could not bear it and picked up the rice paper beside her. He looked at it, thought for a moment, read it again, and tasted it again. His 2 tufts of beard curled up. When the surroundings quieted down, he could not help but recite loudly. Her hands were soft. Her skin was smooth, her collar was smooth, her teeth were sharp, her eyebrows were beautiful, her smile was beautiful, and her eyes were filled with longing. Beautiful? Translated, it means, you are so beautiful. Your hands are as soft as grass, Your skin is as smooth as lard. Your neck is as long and white as a worm. Your teeth are as neat as the seeds of a gourd. Your forehead is as big as the head of a cicada, and your eyebrows are like the whiskers of a moth. Chapter 1072. The audience was mesmerized by the story. When the keeper finished his recitation, the audience erupted into thunderous cheers. This was a metaphor that was closest to life. Was there anything more beautiful than this? The tawu in collar like a tawu referred to the larvae of the insect longhorn beetle. It was a long and white fleshy worm. It was used to describe the woman's long and white neck. This was the most natural compliment, in line with the traditions of this world. When the woman heard the heartfelt applause from the audience below, her hard heart began to melt. Her previous resistance began to dissipate. A few years ago, she was not inferior to anyone here. Even now, how could she be inferior? When confidence returned to her, it naturally followed. When she truly smiled, many of the audience also discovered her unique beauty. Some began to quietly ask around, while others secretly plotted. But when all this happened, her world would change and become more colorful. Then, would she still need to entrust her feelings to this string of prayer beads every night? All of this came from one person, a young man that no one paid attention to, but only she was slowly leaving the crowd. As if he felt her gaze, he turned around and smiled brightly. His smile seemed to be contagious. It reflected from the young man's face into her heart and bloomed again. Actually, the beauty of life depended on the attitude you used to look at it. You could hurt yourself. You could also open your heart. Just like now, she was like a blooming flower, giving her most beautiful smile to a strange traveler. Lu Xiaoyi left Xianlu City. While he was happy for others, he was also happy for himself. This was the correct attitude for a cultivator. He gave a smile to a strange woman, and the woman gave a smile back to him. What kind of qualitative change happened in between? He did not know either. He only knew that the nearly 5-inch nascent soul that had troubled him for decades jumped up lightly with this bright smile. It stood steadily above the 5-inch nascent soul. It was natural. Finally, he could devour spiritual opportunity again. His excitement was over. He leaped up and flew towards the end of the continent. With his current speed, he arrived at the top of the continent in less than a day. Looking from afar, he saw a huge and steep wall piercing through the clouds. It extended to the left and right endlessly. This was a miracle of the natural world. It was a spectacle formed by the combination of the different rays emitted by the 4 stars and the climate and environment of the taiga domain itself. Such a high wall was not something that mortals could pass through. Even cultivators could not do it. The true immortals might be able to give it a try, but the changes they would cause might affect the countless mortals on both sides of the high wall. Therefore, they did not dare to enter. Only once every few hundred years, when the 4-season eyes were formed in the barrier space, would the barrier be at its weakest. Only then would the Yuanying be able to enter. That would be the moment when Buddhism and Taoism would fight 1 year later. On one side of the high wall was eternal spring, while on the other side was eternal winter. This was the wonder of the cultivation world. The width of the wall could not be measured by the actual distance in the domain. This was because, under the influence of many factors, the inside of the high wall had already undergone a mysterious change. It was a space similar to another dimension. In the words of true immortal Mogu, it was enough for the Yuanying cultivators to toss and turn inside. Lu Xiaoyi stuck to the outside of the high wall and silently felt the aura of this mysterious wall. He then flew slowly along the high wall. At the same time, he compared it to the map and grasped the changes in the space of the entire high wall system. The space he was going to fight in the future was such a strange place. The space was not infinitely large. Instead, it was formed by countless narrow spaces. It was like a big house. The cultivators would not fight in the house, but in the walls. It was just that the walls were wide enough for them to punch and kick. After flying forward for a few days, he came to a corner with an even more complicated aura. After careful identification, this should be the point where the three seasons intersected. It was the point where spring, winter, and autumn intersected. In other words, it was a place where the season eyes would definitely be formed. This was a purely mathematical question. If a celestial body was continuously illuminated by 4 stars around it, the light would be divided into 4 colors. Then, how many intersecting points would there be when the light hit the celestial body? The answer was very simple. There would be 4 intersecting points where the season eyes would be formed. According to the rules of the competition between Buddhism and Taoism, each side could only send out 4 people. The most reasonable method was to send 1 cultivator to each intersection point and fight for the season eyes at the same time. To the Taoist sect, even if the Buddhist sect had strong external help, they would still have a high probability of snatching a season eye no matter how weak they were. But in reality, the problem was not that simple. First of all, in terms of arrangement, they had to send 1 cultivator to each intersection point. They could not send 2 or 3 cultivators to 1 intersection point. They had to ensure that they could obtain the season eyes first and leave 1 intersection point empty for the time being. They would leave it for later. This would avoid the disadvantage of the Taoist sect's 4 cultivators entering from the same intersection point at the same time. Secondly, the season eyes would not end once you obtain them, because you would not be able to leave. If you wanted to leave and obtain a season eye, you would have to leave from another season eye's location. In other words, if you obtained the season eyes of the spring, summer, and autumn seasons, then if you wanted to leave, you would have to go to each of the season eyes of the spring, summer, winter, autumn, and winter seasons before you could leave. It was just like unlocking. The 4 locations of the season eyes were an essential part of the unlocking process. In other words, the cultivators who obtained the season eyes had the possibility of meeting each other, and there was also the possibility of snatching and being snatched. Of course, no matter what, the Buddhist sect had to gather all 4 season eyes in order to achieve their goal, which was very difficult. The Taoist sect only needed to obtain 1 season eye and then successfully escape. The complicated rules were created by nature. It was not that the Buddhist sect and Taoist sect deliberately did this. In the end, entering and exiting the 4 seasons barrier was not something that one could do as one pleased. There was one thing that would never change. As long as a cultivator's overall strength was strong, there would not be any problems. However, if one's strength was not enough, it would be very difficult to obtain a season eye through trickery. This was because even if one was lucky enough to obtain a season eye, one would have to fly to the other 3 intersection points in order to leave. The danger involved in this was self-evident. It was still a complicated mathematical problem. How many paths were there from one intersection point to another? If one wanted to guard one intersection point, one would have to guard all 3 directions at the same time. Even though Liu Xiaoyi was not stupid and had some foundation in mathematics, when he thought about these things too much, his head would still hurt. Inexplicable rules, inexplicable people. Even a fight would not be enjoyable. Chapter 1073. Dawn Continent, Ksitigarbha Temple. Rizhao Buddha looked at the 4 bodhisattvas in front of him, his heart filled with emotions. None of those who participated in the battle for the season eyes were from Taigu. This made him feel a little embarrassed, but there was nothing he could do about it. After all, in terms of strength, these Buddhist disciples from different realms were all extremely talented and could completely crush the Ksitigarbha bodhisattvas. Therefore, the temple had chosen Dafa as its external aid monks for this battle. As they all belonged to the same lineage, there was no distinction between outsiders and themselves. Some things did not matter as long as they thought it through. In this regard, Buddhism was much more open-minded than Taoism. Liao Yin, Hongguang, Yi Heng, and Monk Huayuan were the reinforcement from the nearby realms. It had to be said that Buddhism was very united, and the monks they sent were all well-rounded. In the few years they had been in Taigu, they had often verified with the Ksitigarbha bodhisattvas and had a clear advantage. This was also under the condition that they did not use their full strength as guests and did not embarrass themselves. In the nearby realms, there were very few realms that were completely dominated by Buddhism, especially in the large upper realms. Therefore, everyone paid a lot of attention to Taigu's Ksitigarbha temple's comeback this time. They hoped that this would be a breakthrough and a good start in the nearby realms. Unity of wills. Their sharpness could cut through gold. Whether it was the topographic map, environmental changes, or tactical arrangements, they had all been thoroughly discussed in the past few years. Rizhao Buddha was very clear that in the history of the Ksitigarbha Temple and the Dragon Gate sect, they were evenly matched in strength. If this group of people were to replace them, it was certain that they would obtain control of the four-season eyes at the same time. There would not be any accidents. Strength could not be faked. These four monks each had the strength to contend with Buddhas, which made him very envious. However, he still had to give a final reminder. The Dragon Gate sect has many allies in the nearby realms, so we can't rule out the possibility that they will also borrow the strength of other Taoist sects. Therefore, you may not necessarily be facing the Yuaning of the Dragon Gate, but also the Taoist elites of other realms. You must be careful, don't be blindly arrogant. Hong Guang chanted, Ba. Senior, don't worry, we are not here to deal with those frogs at the bottom of the well. The Taoists would definitely make arrangements. Strength reigned supreme. It was useless to say anything else. It's a good opportunity to meet a Taoist master. It's also a great fortune in life. Otherwise, I don't know where to find him. This was the truth. The universe was vast, and there were countless domains. For outstanding cultivators like them, it was difficult to find a worthy opponent in their own domain. But if they went to other domains, it was difficult to find a worthy opponent. Without such a platform, in an unfamiliar domain, who was the true outstanding talent? Are you there? Are you willing to spar? These were all things that couldn't be controlled. Therefore, to them, it was difficult to find a worthy opponent to verify what they had learned. They needed a suitable opportunity and setting, such as the current Taigu Four Seasons barrier. They were all extremely conceited cultivators. After being arrogant for a long time, they longed for new challenges. In their hearts, they did not want their final opponent to be the indigenous cultivators of the Dragon Gate sect. They hoped that they would be able to make the trip worthwhile. The battle between Buddhism and Taoism had a long history. It was originally nothing much, as it was a part of cultivation. Only competition could promote the progress of cultivation. There would always be opponents. Even if it was not Taoism or Buddhism, there would be other forms. However, since the collapse of the Great Tao, such competition gradually became white-hot. Both sides understood that the situation of the cultivation world at the beginning of the new era would depend on the final comparison of power between the two sides in the old era. The more cultivators, the more resources, the more territories, and the higher status would determine the number of cultivators in the new era. No one would let go of such an opportunity. Not only Buddhism, but also many other sects' orthodoxies, such as the body lineage and the spirit lineage. It was just that they were not strong enough, so they did not want to show off. The battle of the Great Tao could not be backed down, especially at such a critical moment. They could not have the mentality of gaining the upper hand after striking. They had to move forward bravely. There was not much time left for everyone. Great Buddha, Rizhao nodded. It was good for young people to be ambitious. He was not dissatisfied with the arrogant tone of the juniors. After all, cultivation had to be proven with time. We still need to have a basic tactical direction between each other. For example, after you succeed, which intersection point should we converge at? Where should we move to? There needs to be an overall consideration. It's not advisable for everyone to be self-disciplined. You have noble character and unquestionable integrity, but Taoism may not be so. It's completely possible for them to gather the strength of a few people and rush to a certain intersection point. Even if your individual strength is stronger, if Taoism separates you, your so-called strength will be a joke. The choice is up to you. Just don't end up in a situation where you are fighting alone. The four of them looked at each other. They all knew what Rizhao Bodhisattva meant. In theory, even if they succeeded in obtaining the season's eye, it did not mean that Buddhism had succeeded, because they still had to bring the season's eye out. The problem was that obtaining the season's eye did not mean that they could kill their opponents. Their opponents could retreat because they were not strong enough, or they could retreat with injuries and find another intersection point to meet up with other Taoist cultivators in hopes of forming a joint force. There were many variables in this, not to mention that some of them could be defeated by Taoists. Since they were all external help, no one dared to say that they would definitely win against Taoists. There were many variables in this. There were also many countermeasures, each with their own advantages. Lying Bodhisattva, who was the oldest among the four, said, "How about this? In principle, no matter if the three of you win or lose, after the results are out, you should all gather at the intersection point of summer, autumn, and winter. I'll wait for 2 hours. After 2 hours, I'll head to the second intersection point of summer, spring, and winter. It can be me alone or a few of us. This way, they would be able to maximize their cooperation, and they would be able to immediately determine the situation of the battle at each intersection point. Junior brothers, you only need to remember that the first 2 hours of the intersection point is summer, autumn, and winter. The second hour's intersection point is summer, spring, and winter. After 4 hours, the situation will be complicated and chaotic. We can only improvise. There's no point in planning now. What do you think of this, junior brothers?" The other three nodded. Bodhisattva Yi Hang was slightly surprised. The premise of this was that senior brother Lying Bodhisattva had to win the first battle. If he lost, there was no point in mentioning anything else. This was also a solution that was not a solution. Don't underestimate the four small seasons' eyes. There were countless variables. Would they win or lose individually? Time of battle? Direction of reinforcements? Direction of retreat? There's no such thing as the best method. This did not include the Taoist response. There were a lot of things to say, they just had to improvise. Only when the last 2 or 3 people met up would it be the final moment. If we can kill in the first battle, we must do so, even if we have to pay a certain price. Otherwise, it will be the beginning of chaos. Chapter 1074. Immortal Mogu bowed and said, "Then I'll leave the matter of Taigu to you. Life is the most important thing. Without the season eye, you can come and go freely. What's a momentary loss in the ever-changing universe? Maybe thousands of years later, the Taoist and Buddhist attitudes toward the 4 seasons will be reversed. Chongqing, Du O, Xiao Xiao Zi, and Shan Er were a little better than the Buddhists. Except for Chongqing, the other 3 were Taoists from other regions. It was not that there were not enough outsiders, but the Dragon Gate sect insisted that they needed at least 1 cultivator to participate. This was the bottom line of being the master. Compared to the monks, the Taoists were much more free and easy. This was the confidence accumulated over dozens of eras. They did not feel that there was a heavy responsibility on their shoulders, which was completely different from the monks who were brave after being ashamed. The 4 of them had already communicated with each other. Due to the complexity of various situations, they could not formulate an overall strategy. Therefore, according to the Taoist habit, they would exert themselves and try their best to cooperate with others after their own battles. From this point of view, it was similar to the Buddhist strategy. Lu Xiaoyi set off on his journey again. Among the 4 intersections, he was assigned to spring, autumn, and winter. As for who his opponent was, he had no idea at all and did not ask. After reaching the nascent soul realm, he seemed to have spent most of his time dealing with the monks and killed many Buddhist disciples. Especially after the battle with Yi Hang, his understanding of the Buddhists had reached a new level. Up until now, the battle with the monk had become quite easy for him. He no longer needed to familiarize himself with, adapt to, and experiment in battle like before. With the merit in hand, everything became traceable. Half a day later, he came to the bottom of a hill under a high wall. This was the intersection of spring, autumn, and winter. He sat down quietly, and the surroundings were quiet. There was no one near the high wall. This was a custom formed over tens of thousands of years. In this world of cultivation, mortals had to learn to not be surprised, as if this was something very normal. No one came to disturb him. He sat cross-legged like this, reflecting on himself and consuming the spirit tablet. His current state of cultivation could already be pushed to the critical point. To be able to achieve this in less than 200 years of nascent soul, he was at a level that was neither too high nor too low. Yuan Ying's cultivation is relatively easy, but the difficulty lies in the step of perfected sovereign. However, his nascent soul has 4 small checkpoints, which is also self-inflicted. After a month of waiting, he suddenly sensed that something was happening within the towering wall. He knew that the season eye had ripened and was ready to be absorbed. Thus, he leaped into the wall and disappeared. This was a completely empty space. Of course, it was impossible for there to be any star stones. But in the void, there were a few Daos mixed in it. Lu Xiaoyi took a closer look and found that the Daos were the 5 elements, yin-yang, and time Daos. This was the power of the 4 stars, as well as the reaction of the Grand Valley's own earth veins. Tangled together, the Grand Valley realm was divided into 4 continents with completely different seasons. Where was the season eye? There was no need to look at the map. He only needed to follow the tangled power of the Daos to find it. Lu Xiaoyi did not hesitate. Now was not the time to talk about tactics. Striking first to gain the upper hand was the truth here. He flew quickly. He knew that his opponent was not necessarily slower than him. After all, who could come here without teleportation? He felt that he was getting closer and closer to the season eye. Before he could see his opponent, his flying sword had already left his body. This was not a sneak attack, but an open and above-board fight. There was no need to hide his tracks. His flying sword was like a long river, vast and mighty. Thousands of sword lights shone brightly in the void. They formed a sword or a dragon that was thousands of miles long. And he, Lu Xiaoyi, was at the end of the sword or a river. He was like a sword herder. He liked sneak attacks. He also liked to fight to his heart's content. He had no scruples. Meng Hongguang was also fighting forward. He continuously teleported and positioned himself, fighting for a chance to strike first. He was very confident, but not because he was careless. This was the powerful origin of a bodhisattva. He came from the strict flower sect. Although it was not widely spread among the many Buddhist branches in the universe, it was a highly respected sect. The true meaning of the sect was the 10 mysterious door and the 6 harmonious door. The 10 mysterious door was the meaning of strict flower sect. It demonstrated the principles of the strict flower sect, that everything was pure and unhindered. Many things were unhindered, 3 lives were unhindered, and all things were unhindered. It was divided into the simultaneous door, the indranet door, the secret hidden door, the subtle compatible door, the 10 lives of Dharma, the hidden door, the hidden door, the hidden door, the different door, and the many compatible different door. The 6 harmonious door technique had 6 different aspects in different stages of the cultivation process. Among them, the total, identical, and complete refer to the whole, and the separate, parallel, and bad refer to the parts and fragments. In the cultivation process, all living beings had to cut off all obstacles. To achieve merit, it was the 10% complete, which was the perfect enlightenment. The strength of the monks of the strict flower sect depended on the combination of the 10 mysterious door and the 6 harmonious door. Different paths led to the same goal. Hongguang focused on the revealing Dharma. It was not that he did not have the energy to study other schools, but in the strict flower sect, 1 school was good enough and 10 schools were good enough. He had mastered the 6 harmonious door technique, which was also his main attack method in battle. Don't think that it was too little. Just the bad door technique alone had ruined countless heroes in the hundreds of years he had been in the nascent soul realm. After teleporting for more than 10 times, he felt that he was very close to the eye. When he reappeared, he had not even seen the eye yet, but from the corner of his eyes, he could already see flying swords flying towards him. It was a swordsman. Bodhisattva Hongguang was surprised and happy to see such an opponent. He was surprised because the swordsman was ferocious. This was a battle of life and death. It was very difficult to make the opponent back off. These troublesome lunatics would not let the opponent have a good time, even before they died. He had to be mentally prepared to pay the price. He was happy that this was destined to be a quick battle. If he could take down his opponent, due to the short amount of time, he would be able to give his companions an advantage in the other battlefields. That would be half the battle. Under the sudden attack of the sword light, Hongguang did not panic at all. His eyes were focused on the sword light, and the mysterious gate rotated. Entrusting a matter to show the Dharma gives birth to the door. Entrusting a matter to show that all matters and Dharma are related to each other. Buddhism also manifested different Dharma through different things, and the different Dharma manifested the same doctrine, causing people to have a correct understanding. Although it sounded incomprehensible, it was actually very simple to use. There was nothing in this space, and the only thing present was endless sword light gushing out. Entrusting a task, where did it come from? Of course, it was the endless sword light. Every sword light was manifested under his profound Buddhist energy. They were related to each other's origin, and they were related to each other's destruction. It was equivalent to how many sword lights there were. Furthermore, there was no need to aim or control. Wherever the flying swords landed, there would be Dharma manifested. For a moment, tens of thousands of sword lights seemed to have been thrown into a black hole, and all of them were destroyed. Chapter 1075. P.S. It's the last day of the month. Those who still have a monthly ticket, please vote now. Thank you, my friends. Chinese New Year is coming. I'll try my best to save more tickets to satisfy everyone during the holidays. Lu Xiaoyi praised in his heart. However, his response was more sword lights. Can't you show your Dharma? Let's see how many Dharma you can show. You can easily destroy 10,000 sword lights. What about 10,000? What about 100,000? There's a limit to a person's strength. As long as you're not a deity, there's a limit to it. If you can show your Dharma endlessly, I'll turn around and leave. This was Lu Xiaoyi's simple thought. However, Hongguang didn't just know how to show his Dharma. He also had the ability to show his Dharma's evil Dharma. Evil Dharma's evil Dharma. This Dharma wasn't Hongguang's Dharma, but his opponent's Dharma. It was a Dharma that was described to his opponent by virtue and then destroyed. This Dharma was born out of fate. It wasn't a physical attack, but something in the dark. This was the standard to measure a cultivator's ability. For example, they despised people like the swordsman who relied on brute force. The best way to deal with the swordsman wasn't to rely on brute force, but to suppress him from a higher level. This was also the reason why he was confident in dealing with the swordsman. Upon seeing the swordsman, Hongguang immediately showed his Dharma. This Dharma was described when the opponent couldn't sense it. At the very least, among 100 Taoists, 99 would be ignorant. The only one would be the most knowledgeable amongst the Taoists. However, this didn't include the vulgar swordsman. The swordsman was still madly exerting his strength. The 10,000 sword lights from before were obviously just a test. Therefore, the next 10,000 sword lights were within his expectations. Hongguang smiled. As he showed his Dharma, the sword lights were destroyed one by one. Trying to find his bottom line? This was far from enough. He had been in the late stage of the Bodhisattva realm for 100 years. His cultivation was unimaginably deep. Under all kinds of fortuitous encounters, he had far surpassed his peers. Otherwise, he wouldn't have come here to save Taigu. Among the 4 people who came with him, he was not as good as Yi Hang in terms of merit realm. However, in terms of Buddhist cultivation, he dared to claim to be the leader of the 4. Even the oldest, Liao Yin, was not as good as him. This was a contest of pure strength. In terms of spiritual power, the swordsman was stronger than him, so he would be able to find out his bottom line very quickly. However, if he was stronger than the swordsman, then he would never be able to do anything unless he used his Tao state energy. That was another realm altogether. However, the ease with which he was able to perform the technique was unable to offset his failure in describing his opponent's phase. He could use the power of merit to draw a sketch of the swordsman, and he could also create his Dharma form. But it just couldn't be spoiled. This was because the sword lunatic's phase was originally a bad one. He had cultivated the evil face for hundreds of years, but he had never seen such a strange thing before. Everyone had merit. It was just a matter of how much. What he did was to use a certain method to describe this person's Dharma form. Then, through his understanding of Buddhist principles, he would find the flaws and weaknesses and destroy them in one fell swoop. It was like molding a clay doll. Once it was done, he would smash it into pieces. This was the evil face's killing application. Of course, this was not called killing, but redeeming. However, even if this person's phase was created, it would never take shape. If it was not formed, how could it be destroyed? Was the material wrong? Was the method wrong? Or did this person not have any merit at all? It was as if he was molding an air doll whose shape was constantly changing. An air doll? How about I do the opposite and help him perfect his phase and beautify it? Then, Hongguang could not make up his mind. The evil face was his sharpest Buddhist punishment. It was not that he did not know other Buddhist techniques, such as the Vajra's glare or the Vajra's flying Vajra. However, it was a pity that these techniques were useless against the swordsman's flying sword. In terms of mystical attacks, he was miles ahead of the swordsman. In terms of physical attacks, the swordsman was miles ahead of him. Before he could make up his mind, the number of sword rays on the flying sword had increased to more than 100,000. He had no choice but to focus and not be careless in the slightest. Although they had not fought for long, as an experienced Buddhist protector, he had already sensed that something was amiss in this short period of time. This intuition had helped him avoid danger countless times and helped him make the sharpest response in a battle of life and death. He could no longer treat the swordsman as an ordinary opponent who only knew how to use brute force. There was something strange about this person. He had to start from the harmony of the 6 phases. The harmony of the 6 phases involved the contradiction between the parts and the whole, identity and difference, creation and destruction. Success was bad, and vice was good. Since he couldn't do anything to this sword cultivator with his bad form, then he would use his good form and do the opposite. Taking action as soon as he thought of it was Hongguang's characteristic. Although he was a monk, he never lacked the courage to gamble on the line between life and death. According to his intuition, such judgment had helped him win many times in decisive battles, and also strengthened his confidence in his fighting style. The swordsman's sword rays increased. After the hundreds of thousands of sword lights were annihilated, another 200,000 sword lights appeared in the next round. Hongguang found it hard to understand how a person who was not even in the middle stage of yuanying could produce so many sword rays. It was completely illogical. In his impression, a swordsman in the early stage of yuanying could only produce around 10,000 sword rays. A middle-stage swordsman would only produce around 30 to 50,000 sword rays. However, this understanding was completely useless in front of this swordsman. Perhaps he was indeed outstanding, or else he would not have been sent here. Hongguang suddenly realized a problem. According to the swordsman's concept of explosive power, if he could produce 200,000 sword rays in one go, why would he be like this swordsman? From 10,000 to 10,000 to 100,000 and finally to 200,000? This kind of tactic was definitely not the swordsman's style. If an ordinary swordsman could understand this logic, how could such a powerful swordsman not understand it? Since he did this, there must be a conspiracy behind it. Realizing this, Hongguang immediately realized that it was inappropriate for him to change his bad appearance into a good one. It was too late for him to retract his sword. Lu Xiaoyi smiled evilly. His own creation face. He poked a huge hole in the inflatable doll that the monk was fiddling with. Hongguang was in the middle of creation face. He would never have thought that the swordsman would disfigure his own face. The backlash immediately caused a flaw to appear in his harmony of the 6 elements, a loophole. This loophole appeared at such an unfortunate time. Of course, it could also be a deliberate arrangement by the swordsman. Just as Hong Guang was exerting all his strength to produce 200,000 sword rays, this loophole caused a series of consequences. In the end, the creation phase could not completely destroy the flying swords, and missed out on a portion of them. At the last moment of his life, Hong Guang finally understood why he had lost. He had lost to a swordsman who was proficient in karma. This was a 1 in a million chance, and he was helpless. How could a vulgar swordsman be so proficient in karma? Hong Guang's consciousness was dissipating. He no longer had anything to do with the new era. Even if he reincarnated, would it be too late? Chapter 1076. P.S. It's the start of a new month. Please guarantee the monthly votes. Eruption? Wait a few days for the new year. Then I'll let everyone see all they want. Lu Xiaoyi leaped forward, ignoring the monk's Tao dissipation, and arrived at the GI. It was a single eye filled with spirituality. It was a cat's eye. It had no physical body, but was a bundle of intertwined Tao realms. There was no black eye. If he took it and carried it with him, he wouldn't be able to get out of the Four Seasons barrier. He would have to bring this blind cat's eye to the other 3 intersections, take it out, and fuse it. Only then would he be able to get out of here. This thing wouldn't exist forever. After he took it out and returned to the mainland, it would slowly wither away over hundreds of years. The moment it finally disappeared would be the day a new cat's eye would be born in the Four Seasons barrier. The power of Tao was very mysterious. It wasn't easy to take it away. It required time. This thing was formed by the fusion of 3 innate Taos, the 5 elements, yin-yang, and time. He now had a deep understanding of the 5 elements, but he was still at the entry level of time and yin-yang. Of course, the other cultivators weren't much stronger than him. Some were even weaker than him. They were only Yuaniing cultivators. Very few of them had a deep understanding of Tao realms in different directions. While breaking the GI's bindings, he recalled the process of the battle. This was his review after every battle. It was an indispensable part of his combat ability. The first part was actual combat, and the second part was to find his shortcomings. He didn't use the sword light division at the beginning on purpose. As an experienced Buddhist fighter, he knew that although he had some hidden techniques in the Tao of merit, it wasn't enough to cover all the Buddhist secret techniques. Merit was only a part of Buddhism. It was far from being the whole of it. Explosive power also needed to be guided according to the situation and targeted at the opponent's weakness. Even if 3 axes had to be swung in the right place, otherwise it would be useless. Not only would it be a waste of precious magical power, but it would also easily expose the details of one's explosive power to the opponent. The higher one's cultivation level was, the more varied the tactics one could choose to use. The kind of impulsive fighting style was becoming more and more childish. That was because among the top experts in the nascent soul stage, having mysterious abilities was often the standard, and fighting over the Tao realm was the foundation. When would he be able to brandish his sword and chop at people's heads? That would be after he reached the late stage of Yuaniing, when he no longer needed to worry about his cultivation. Depending on the stage, there would be a fighting style. Depending on the opponent, there would be a strategy. The 10,000 rays of sword light were a test. The moment the monk revealed his ability, he immediately realized that such a miraculous Buddhist technique was not something that could be solved by simply exploding his sword. Therefore, he continued to probe. After Hong Guang's stunning performance, he immediately fainted. His bad looks completely exposed his foundation in front of Lu Xiaoyi. Playing with merits? It would be strange if he didn't trick you to death. Now that he had the method, all that was left was the timing. For a seasoned fighter like him, of course, he would choose to launch an attack at the most difficult time for his opponent. There was nothing else to say. Hong Guang's tragedy was his merit. He couldn't be blamed. He could only blame Yi Heng. This was a brand new way to slay the enemy. It was completely different from the foolish efforts of the past. Instead, It was a surprise attack that stood out during the Battle of the Tao Realm. It was settled in a casual manner, without a trace of anger. This was the characteristic of a high-level battle between real cultivators, right? It was not like a street gangster where the two of them fought until their faces were covered in blood. He was also exploring how to perfectly integrate swordsmanship and the Tao realm. This was a huge topic that might take him a lifetime to explore. However, Lu Xiaoyi's advantage was that he had a basic understanding of most of the innate Daos. As the Daos collapsed one by one, his basic understanding would rise to a deeper level. This was his trump card. Of course, he could never fall behind in his swordsmanship. Only when he could force out all of his opponent's swordsmanship would he have the possibility to improve further. This sequence could not be reversed. Lu Xiaoyi corrected some of his extreme thoughts during his reflection, allowing himself to return to the right path. He decided that he would use another method against his next opponent, a method that was more swordsman's. He wasn't going to pin all his hopes on merit, just because he was successful in using merit this time. A successful use of merits had instead allowed him to see the drawbacks. This was who he was. This was the true core of why he had never stopped growing stronger. Never satisfied, never overflowing. After the review, the spirit eye was successfully removed. He estimated the time. It took about half an hour to remove the spirit eye. Then, was he the fastest? There were 3 paths in front of him. They led to 3 different points. Which one should he choose? That was the question. There was no question of which point was more important. Thus, he could only choose. He would choose whichever companion was weaker. Of course, he could also think of it the other way around. He would choose whichever companion was the strongest, because that would increase the probability of 2 against 1. It was also safer. There was no question of who was better or worse. It only depended on the cultivator's confidence. Lu Xiaoyi was confident enough, so he chose the former. The one who was relatively weaker was Spring, Summer, and Autumn's Chongqing. He was the only one among the 4, the Dragon Gate Taoist. It cannot be said that he was weak. He was one of the strongest in Taigu. However, compared to these top Yuanian cultivators in dozens of universes, there was still a clear gap. After identifying the direction, he sprinted. Because the space within the 4 seasons barrier was completely different from the size of the Taiga domain, there was still some distance to cover. Even if he ran at full speed, it would still take nearly 2 hours. In fact, such a long time was enough for both sides to determine the winner in most cases. He could only place his hopes on luck. At this point, no one could make the best choice purposefully. He flew as fast as he could and arrived at the intersection of Spring, Summer, and Autumn in a few moments. Before he reached, he felt a chill in his heart. His luck was not good enough. Not only was there no aura of the spirit eye, there was also no aura of other cultivators. He knew it was not good. Based on the strength of the monk he came into contact with, if the 4 Buddhists were all at this level, Chongqing had no chance of winning at all. The best result would have been to delay and persevere. However, since the spirit eye had been taken away, Chongqing was doomed. For someone like him who always took the initiative, it was difficult for him to stay in one place and wait passively. Then, where should he go next? He still had no clue. However, if he had to choose a unique path, he chose to go back again, back to the place where he had taken the spirit eye. The reason was simple. It was impossible that all the places he had passed by were empty, right? Were the remaining people gathered at the other 2 intersection points? If he chose to go to those 2 intersection points that he had not been to, he might as well go back. Chapter 1077. Lu Xiaoyi thought that he had succeeded in his plan, so he decided to play a smart trick and return. However, when he returned to the intersection point of Spring, Summer, and Winter, there was still no one there. He immediately realized where the problem was. He wanted to be unconventional and achieve surprise, but he had forgotten the most important thing: probability. He might have missed a few crucial battles perfectly. Because of his arrogance, his companions could not get his help. The more anxious he was to join the battle, the more he seemed to be avoiding it. With the strength of the monk he had encountered, he did not think that his companions would be able to gain an advantage in the battle. He had also missed the opportunity to join forces with his companions. In other words, he would have to face a group beating next. That was also the fate of being beaten up. Although he really wanted to beat up others. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter were making his head spin. Thus, he had set the first point he had entered as point 1, and the point where he had failed to reach as point 2. Now, there were still points 3 and 4 that he had not gone to. His current problem was that he had missed twice in a row, which meant that his rhythm was wrong. One wrong step led to many wrong steps. Now, he had to decide where to go. Should he correct his mistake and fly to points 3 and 4, or continue to charge back to point 2? There was no reason for this. It was nothing more than intuition. But now, there was a problem with his intuition. Where's the problem? Lu Xiaoyi realized the power of time. Because he was not proficient in the Tao of time, in this special environment, his judgment was always half a beat late. As a result, he missed time and time again. He could not correct his intuition because there was no way to improve his Tao of time quickly. Since his intuition could no longer help him, he could only rely on his goal. What was his goal? Of course, it was to leave with at least one season eye. Thus, he could not think too much about other things. The only thing he could do now was to go to points 3 and 4. At least, he had to give himself a precondition to leave at any time. After figuring out the nature of the situation, he directly flew to point 3. Whoever he bumped into, he did not care too much about it. Good luck was always intermittent, but bad luck could continue. When Lu Xiaoyi arrived at point 3, there was still no one there. It was as if everyone was trying their best to avoid him. However, even though there was nothing, he could still smell a trace of aura from the nothingness. It was the remnant aura of an intense battle. He laughed coldly and couldn't be bothered to deduce anything from the remnant aura. He directly rushed to the 4th location. If there was still no one there, then it was the will of the heavenly Tao. He would directly pass through the wall and leave. They made some preparations, but the sword light in front of them had already blotted out the sky and covered the earth. Hundreds of thousands of sword lights almost occupied the entire space. The Buddhist enchantment that Liao Yin had hurriedly set up in front of them was destroyed in an instant. The surging Tao realm of slaughter made these monks who had served Buddha for a long time feel a chill in their bones. It was the swordsmen. Liao Yin and Huayuan monk looked at each other. Both of them were worried. The reason why they were worried was because the two of them had a unique Buddhist heritage. Liao Yin came from Mandala Temple, while Huayuan monk came from Gaojin Temple. Although the two temples were separated by the vast universe, they belonged to the same Buddhist lineage. Not to mention Buddhist teachings, each had its own emphasis. However, they walked the same path in terms of protection methods, which were the 6 supernatural powers of Buddhism. The 6 supernatural powers of Buddhism were omniscience, clairvoyance, celestial feet, predestination connection, and omniscience connection. These were the core Buddhist protection methods of their Buddhist lineage. Of course, they should have all the methods of ordinary monks, such as Dharma form, Vajra, Buddhist kingdom, mantra, and so on. However, their specialty was in the 6 supernatural powers. It was because they had cultivated one or a few supernatural powers that those ordinary Buddhist techniques became extremely powerful. For example, Liao Yin majored in clairvoyance, but also dabbled in omniscience connection. As a result, when he was fighting with others, it was very difficult for his opponent's every move and intention to escape his eyes. To a certain extent, he could find out what the opponent was thinking. Don't underestimate this kind of thing that was similar to Taoism's aid. Before the opponent even made a move, he could already know what the opponent was thinking. This was too dangerous. There were no secrets to speak of, nor were there any tactical arrangements to speak of. Coupled with clairvoyance, even if the opponent couldn't guess the opponent's purpose, as long as the opponent made a move, the opponent's intention would be immediately exposed. To be able to do this in a battle, one could basically be in an invincible position. Whether to attack or stay, to charge or to retreat, the insight was always in the first place. It was especially useful for Dharma cultivators who had a slow battle rhythm. During the encirclement and suppression of the Taoist just now, it was precisely because of his coordination that they could achieve the final glorious result without paying a huge price. Chapter 1078. On the other hand, Huayuan monk was proficient in another supernatural power, Buddhist celerity. Buddhist celerity was also known as divine state or Rui mastery. With Rui mastery, one could do anything as he wished. For example, he could drill through the sky, move mountains and seas, turn beings into soldiers, summon the wind and rain, and ride on the clouds. Most importantly, he could use his clones to travel around unpredictably. Simply put, a monk who was proficient in Buddhist celerity was the swordsman among monks. They were proficient in the art of traveling freely. Compared to a swordsman, the only thing they lacked was a sword. Instead, they used various Buddhist techniques to replace it. They might lose the refinement of the sword, but they had the breadth of the Buddhist Dharma. It was hard to say which path was better or worse. Compared to the other two monks, Yang and Hongguang, their approaches were quite different. They took the pragmatic approach, using their supernatural powers as their foundation and the basic Buddhist magic as their offense and defense. Yang and Hongguang, on the other hand, took the approach of emptiness, focusing more on the state of Tao. What they focused on was the mysterious path of the illusory and the combination of the Buddhist doctrine. There was no difference in who was better or more orthodox. It was just a difference in direction. However, when it came to dealing with a swordsman, it was widely acknowledged that the path of emptiness was more specialized. This was because in terms of pragmatism, whether it was Buddhism or Taoism, who could compare to a swordsman who spent his entire life studying killing? However, Hongguang had already been eliminated. No one knew if he was dead or alive. Yi Hang was at the third position, and it would take some time for reinforcements to arrive. It was risky to let the two of them fight the swordsman head-on. After all, this was a swordsman who could defeat Hongguang. There was no doubt about his strength. The difficult part was that this sword cultivator was determined to charge towards the fourth position. It was obvious that he wanted to jump out of the Four Seasons barrier after fusing with the fourth position. In any case, for a Taoist, obtaining one season I was already considered a success. There was no need to obtain all four. Therefore, they had to fight him. They couldn't let him succeed. The Buddhist sex arrangement this time was basically a success. Now, they were only left with this last tremble. No one was willing to be defeated by a mere person. The two of them were of the same mind. They knew that the best way now was to fight head-on without showing any weakness. They couldn't afford to be defensive all the time just to wait for Yi Hang's reinforcements. That was a taboo in battle. Although the ultimate goal might be to wait for Yi Hang's return, the process of waiting was a watershed to judge a cultivator's insight and ability. For experts like them, when there was no one to help them, they would go all out. Only in this way could they display their full strength, and not because they had someone else to rely on. The two monks were very clear that if they were to think too much during the battle with the swordsman, they would be courting death. As soon as the flying swords appeared, the derivation divine ability was activated. Although there were hundreds of thousands of sword lights, all the sword traces were recorded in one's mind. This was almost impossible for ordinary people. The number and power of the sword river, as well as the exclusiveness of killing in the perception of the divine sense, made it impossible for people to look directly at it. However, with the celestial eyes, none of this was a problem. It was just that his heart connection couldn't be used in a short period of time. He needed to come into contact with it in battle. Furthermore, heart connection wasn't his main cultivation. Not only was this divine ability difficult, it was also selective. It was useless against cultivators whose realm was higher than his. This was also the reason why he mainly cultivated the celestial eyes and supplemented it with heart connection. There were too many restrictions. On the other hand, monk Huayuan leaped and disappeared without a trace. His real body and doppelganger intertwined in the void, making it impossible to distinguish between the real and the fake. This was a real doppelganger, one that could think and execute the same dharma. Although there was only one, it was much stronger than the pure illusion of the other cultivators. Lu Xiaoyi's sword Qi River swept in, and his body disappeared without a trace at the same time. With just a touch, he knew that he had bumped into two tough bones. The only good news was that there weren't three of them. Buddhist divine arts practitioners weren't easy to deal with. He had met quite a number of practitioners with divine arts. However, Buddhist divine arts were a cut above others in terms of pretentiousness. They were higher than similar divine arts of Taoism, such as body cultivators and soul cultivators. Because they were few in number, they were extremely precious. Why did one ask for divine arts? The root of the problem was greed. Cultivating based on one's heart was extremely harmful. There wasn't anyone in the world who didn't want to ask for divine arts, but they didn't know the nature of divine arts. Thus, they cultivated blindly, causing harm to themselves and others. The divine arts of humans were related to one's nature. For example, there was fire in a lamp, and fire had light. If the fire didn't emit light, it wasn't without light. The problem was that there was no obstruction, and it was covered by the 7 emotions and 6 desires. People didn't understand divine arts, so they used transformations as divine arts, which was a huge mistake. Transformations were illusions, and they were similar to techniques. They couldn't be used without a basis, but divine arts were different. There were 5 sources of connection and a level of power. The first was demonic connection, the second was reporting connection, and the third was relying on connection. These 3 were called connection in fake name, but in reality, they weren't. Thus, they didn't know the truth, and they were bound to change. The 4 divine arts, the first was heavenly eyes, the second was heavenly ears, the third was other heart, the fourth was predestination, and the 5th was divine feet. Although they were called divine arts, there was a truth. There was only one kind of connection, and it was also the highest realm of connection. It was to connect all the leaks and not to connect all the leaks. This wasn't something that Bodhisattva or Buddha could set foot in. Only Bodhi could explore it. Judging from the attacking methods of the 2 monks, they belonged to the orthodox methods of Buddhism, and there was nothing special about them. However, under the contrast of the marvelous divine abilities, their ordinary and mediocre attacks were able to bring out the unique effects of the ordinary, decaying, and miraculous. At first contact, Lu Xiaoyi immediately felt that they were different. To him, there was another factor that he had to consider. Would there be a 3rd monk coming to his aid? If there was, then there was a high probability that he only had a few minutes, which was the flying time from one intersection point to another in the 4 seasons barrier. Fighting against these 2 monks, merit was useless, because they didn't cultivate merit. This, on the contrary, aroused Lu Xiaoyi's competitive spirit. As long as there weren't any weird things from Buddhism, who would his flying sword be afraid of? It wasn't all bad news, because they had to prevent Lu Xiaoyi from getting too close to the 4th point where the season eye was formed. The 2 monks didn't dare to stray too far from this place. To a cultivator, a point in space was a matter of teleportation. Because of this, the 2 monks divided the work. Lu Yu stood firmly in this position, not straying too far from the left and right. Because of the power of his heavenly eyes, he could accurately judge Lu Xiaoyi's flying sword's momentum, strength, sword trace, momentum, Tao state, transformation, and combination. Nothing was missed. It was also because of such accurate and detailed judgment that he was able to make the most targeted defense, the most effective, and the most complete. Even if he was forced to defend a single point and had a limited range of movement, he was still able to defend himself in the end. For a cultivator in such a state, No matter how strong his defense was, it was basically impossible for him to defend himself against a swordsman like Lu Xiaoyi. Lu Yu was able to do this not only because of his heavenly eyes, but also because the begging monk had attracted too much attention from the swordsman outside. Chapter 1079. Attacking one of them was the best way to deal with a two-man siege. The question was which one to attack. The advantage of placing the breakthrough point on Liang was that he wouldn't dare to move around. He could only bear the brunt of the attack. The advantage of attacking the monk was that he could prevent Liang from helping him. The reason was still the same. Liang couldn't leave so easily in order to prevent him from occupying the position of season eye. Comparatively speaking, he was more inclined to break through Liang's defense. The other monk was too strange. He couldn't differentiate between his real body and his doppelganger. Even if he used the karma realm, he couldn't do it because this monk didn't practice karma. With two targets, his attack power would be divided. He couldn't attack in one go. To attack Liang, he had to create the illusion that he was attacking the monk. It required a certain amount of preparation and a reasonable attacking position. In order to deceive the two experienced veterans, he had to make a lot of things seem real. He wasn't worried that Liang's defense was impenetrable. Compared to Hongguang, Liang's defense was just a basic Buddhist technique. His foundation was solid, but he lacked Hongguang's casualness. Liao Yin could indeed see through his tactical arrangements and combinations. But so what? Seeing through and blocking were two different things. When the flying sword's attack power completely exceeded his ability, he wouldn't be able to block it even if he could see through it. Lu Xiaoyi's sword aura river flowed freely as he flew around. His attacks began to focus on Liang, while his figure began to chase after the monk's real body and doppelganger. He needed a window of time, even if it was 2 or 3 breaths. Lu Yu was having a hard time defending because the pressure was increasing on his body. This was easy to understand. He could move easily. This was also their only weakness. The swordsman's sword was heavy, heavier than expected. It wasn't just the fact that he had more sword aura than a swordsman of the same level. The sword aura was many times more than a normal swordsman, and the strength of a single sword was many times stronger. His Tao realm energy could circulate freely, and the combination of sword techniques was easy to grasp. When all these were gathered together, he didn't need any tricks to crush his defense. He finally understood why Hongguang had failed. If he were to face this swordsman alone, he would still lose. This was no longer a problem that could be solved by the so-called divine ability or secret technique, but an all-around suppression. A guy who had just reached the middle stage of yuanying was crushing them. The swordsman's offensive prowess was well-deserved. He wondered where this guy had popped out from. There was no such powerful sword vein orthodoxy in the dozens of nearby universes. Senior brother Liao Yin, Sword Lunatic has the intention to attack you. Because you can't move away. I will try my best to hold him back from the outside, but you have to be careful. I think he still has some strength left. Huayuan monk reminded. Liao Yin agreed with his judgment. Don't worry, I can still hold on. There was a way to deal with a temporary outburst, but you also have to be careful. This lunatic might also attack you. The pressure he is exerting on me is just a cover. There's a benefit to attacking you. I might not be able to help you due to the distance. Both of them were very cautious. In the face of a great enemy, even the slightest bit of carelessness could lead to disastrous results. Their divine ability was indeed powerful, but the direction of their divine ability was in support. Against the spell cultivator, their divine ability was very targeted. But against this sword lunatic in front of them, who appeared and disappeared unpredictably with a long river of sword aura that was both offensive and defensive. In front of such an opponent, their attacks were slightly mediocre and lacked uniqueness. There were countless branches of Buddhism, and they focused on countless things. If one chose to use supernatural powers, they would lose a lot. For example, the sturdy Buddhist kingdom and the application of Buddhism's Tao realm meant that there were gains and losses. It was also something that cultivators could not avoid. It was the same for Taoism, and the sword range agreed. In order to restrain him, they still needed Yi Hang's arrival. In Lu Yin's perception, a large portion of the sword lunatic's hundreds of thousands of sword aura had been transferred to his body. This caused him to almost completely give up on counterattacking. At that moment, the Dharma form's 1,000 hands danced wildly, and countless Buddhist weapons circled around. The Buddhist chants from his mouth were majestic, and his golden body became increasingly sturdy. Just as he was in a tight spot, Begging Monk had no choice but to increase his efforts to restrain the sword lunatic, even at the risk of danger. Begging Monk's two bodies revolved around each other, one real and the other separated. During normal attacks, one in the light and one in the dark, one in the front and one in the back, one real and one fake. This was also the safest way to battle. If one body was in danger of being killed, he could use the other body to pull it back with ease. But now, in order to reduce the pressure on Li'in, he had no choice but to attack with both bodies. In a flash, the sword lunatic's sword aura expanded once again, and the sword aura split from hundreds of thousands to almost 200,000. When Begging Monk felt the changes in the sword aura, he immediately realized that Li'in was in danger. He was afraid that Li'in wouldn't be able to withstand such intense and crazy sword aura. Without hesitation, he merged his two bodies together and transformed into a two-headed Buddha. Holding a stake, his body became infinitely large, and his Buddhist energy boiled for a short period of time. His four long arms formed a strange Buddhist mudra and locked onto the swordsman. At this moment, the sword aura that filled the sky suddenly changed directions on the way to Li'in, giving up on Li'in and clashing with the two-headed Buddha. Begging Monk had never faced the swordsman head-on before. This time, when he merged his two bodies, he immediately suffered a painful blow from his opponent. He immediately understood that the swordsman's real target was him. Merging his two bodies would temporarily increase his strength by a large margin. But at the same time, he would lose the ability to clone himself, and he would lose the state of his divine limbs. This kind of clash was the last thing he wanted, because his specialty wasn't to clash head-on with his opponent. Otherwise, what was the point of cultivating divine limbs? He knew that this wasn't a good idea. Even if he merged his two bodies, without Lu Yin's Heaven's Eye, it would be difficult for him to gain an advantage in a head-on clash like this. If he were to lose, he wouldn't even have a way out. At this moment, Lu Yin's divine sense transmitted to him, "Come to my side. His final target is me." At the last moment, Lu Yin finally understood the swordsman's true intention through his telepathy eye. He wanted to force Begging Monk to switch from his two-headed Buddha state to his two-body state. He wanted to make use of these 2 or 3 breaths of time to launch a decisive attack on him. The next change happened at the same time. Begging Monk's two heads shook, and with the help of the splitting and reuniting forces, both his real body and his clone appeared beside Li'in at the same time. He was extremely impressed by his senior's telepathy eye, and without any hesitation, he chose to listen to Lu Yin's judgment. At the same time, the river of flying swords once again changed directions, and the direction of the sword aura was directed at Li'in, who was guarding the Heaven's Eye. Lu Yin's judgment was very accurate. Lu Xiaoyi had deceived him 3 times in a row, and the huge amount of spiritual energy he had expended to direct the swords to change directions had lost its meaning. When the 3 bodies of the 2 monks merged together, even if he unleashed a burst of swords, he wouldn't be able to break through the combined defense of the 2 monks. Since there wasn't a chance, Lu Xiaoyi wouldn't force it. Without any hesitation, he retracted the river of swords and disappeared in an instant. Chapter 1080. The 2 monks couldn't understand. What was going on? Did he run away? It wasn't a good idea to run away in such a situation. Once the 3 of them gathered together, they would truly be in an undefeatable position. Fortunately, Liao Fun, who could read minds, understood the situation even faster. Not good. He's trying to ambush Junior Yihang after seeing that we can't defeat him. Huayuan monk also understood the situation. Wasn't that right? The lunatic swordsman was heading straight for the third position. His goal was self-evident. The two of them were quick-witted individuals. They instantly understood the pros and cons of this situation. If the two of them didn't move, Yihang would undoubtedly have to face the ferocious swordsman alone. Although Yihang's swastika was impressive, the two of them had just experienced the swordsman's attack power. If they really fought, it wouldn't bode well for them. If the two of them chased after him, it would also be a huge problem. This was because if the swordsman suddenly turned around while running, with his ability to control the sword, the two of them would not be able to stop him. In other words, the swordsman might be able to return to the fourth point before them and complete the fusion of the 4 points of intersection there. Then, he would be able to pass through the barrier and leave. The Taoists would also achieve their goal. This time, Huayuan monk voiced his opinion. I'll chase after him. Senior brother, you stay here. Perhaps the three of us will be in a dangerous situation for a short period of time. However, it won't last long. As long as the person we're facing can hold on for a short while, reinforcements will arrive. His meaning was clear. If he chased after him, no matter who the swordsman chose as his opponent, he or Yihang would be able to catch up in a short time. If the swordsman chose to return to the fourth position, he wouldn't even need to stop him. All he needed to do was to follow him closely. In the end, they would return to the previous situation. The only difference was that Yihang was getting closer. Liao Fan nodded in agreement. This was the most comprehensive plan at the moment. However, it wasn't detailed enough. He smiled and said, "All right, that's how it is. However, it's not good for you to chase after him now. Let's wait for a while before chasing after him." The monk nodded his head in admiration. The logic was obvious. The distance between the two intersection points was about 2 hours, which was 8 quarters. When they set off at the same time, the time they took to arrive at the fourth point should be the same as the time Yihang took to arrive at the third point. After all, their speeds were about the same. Although the battle between the two of them at point 4 was intense, it was only a quarter of an hour. In other words, when Sword Lunatic had turned around and left, Yihang had already set off from point 3 for a quarter of an hour. Considering that the Night Sailor and the Swordsman were flying opposite each other, the encounter between them would happen in 2 to 3 quarters of an hour. Therefore, it would be inappropriate for the beggar monk to chase after the swordsman's tail. It was very likely that the swordsman would turn around again. The biggest advantage of waiting for half an hour before giving chase was that it would reduce the amount of time he had to face the swordsman alone. As long as he could hold on for even a moment, there would definitely be reinforcements. This was an extremely cunning opponent. Once he realized something was amiss, he would immediately think of another plan. They had to treat this seriously. When the three of them truly surrounded him, it would be much easier to fight. Lu Xiaoyi leaped out, lamenting in his heart. He could tell that although the divine ability of a Liao Yin monk was invisible and untouchable, it was extremely useful in battle. It would cause all of his plans to fail before they could be executed. Facing such an opponent alone was not a problem. He could just rely on his own strength to crush the opponent. However, if he had reinforcements, their cooperation would be flawless. He could not think of a way to break through at the moment. He could only open up another battlefield, even if it meant that he would have to face 3 opponents at the same time, even faster. Whether to face the monk flying from the third point or the monk chasing after him from behind, there was no set rule. It all depended on the situation. If the monk chasing after him was too fast, he would turn around and deal with the monk first. If the monk chasing after him was too slow, then he would have to deal with the reinforcements coming from the third point. He was very sure that it was impossible for the 2 monks to chase after him at the same time. It was even more impossible for them not to chase after him. It could only be one chasing and the other defending. The key was the rhythm of the chase. After flying out of the perception of each other's divine senses, he immediately stopped and remained silent for hundreds of breaths. There was no aura of pursuers behind him. He sighed. These 2 monks were really cunning. Were they forcing him to seek help from a complete stranger? And he was sure that in 1 or 2 minutes, the pursuers behind him would set off. Then, should he kill or kill the familiar? If he turned around and killed the familiar, he might be able to gain more time. The problem was that the monk could retreat to the fourth point at any time. In the end, it would be a chase. Everything would return to how it was at the beginning of the battle. With the monk with the all-seeing connection, he was not confident. The one chasing after him must be a begging monk who had a special skill in vertical movement. This was inevitable. He knew very well that the Buddha's limbs, who was good at moving at high speed, would cause great trouble for his hunting because he himself was like this. To kill the monk, he needed time. He needed distance. The current distance was not enough. He had made up his mind and no longer worried about his gains and losses. He decided to kill. At the very least, he would not be faster than the monk, right? He might only have about 15 minutes, but definitely not more than 2 minutes. The monks were very smart and experienced. Rushing forward at full speed, he actually did not feel much pressure. He did not care much about the outcome of the battle because it was not necessarily a good thing for the Taoists to win this round. It meant that the mortals of the Taiga Temple would have to continue enduring the separation of the 4 seasons. Of course, the mortals had already gotten used to it. There was no standard answer to this kind of thing. Success could be a bad thing. Failure could be a good thing. He did not think about this. He only thought about the battle of wits and courage. This was what a swordsman should think about. As for the battle between Buddhism and Taoism, when was it his turn to decide the direction of the battle between Yuanying and Taoism? His life was not in danger. Since he could not tell whether the outcome was good or bad, he did not have to insist on anything. If he really could not handle the 3 monks, he could at least throw away the all-seeing connection and escape, right? He did not have the mental misophobia to charge forward bravely, nor did he have the obsessive-compulsive disorder to win. It was already 3 against 1. Why should he pretend to be a wolf? It was ridiculous. This was a very interesting battle. From it, he saw the foundation of Buddhism. The elite monks were not to be underestimated. He seemed to have rarely seen such outstanding cultivators of the same level in the Taoist Yuanying. Qing Xian might be one of them, but Slug and Hairlip were not as good. He did not know if his swordsman brothers in the Shaking Shadow Realm could match up to these 2 fellows. There were still a few outstanding fellows in the Shaking Shadow Realm. His mind was diverging with irrelevant thoughts. He did not care about the unfamiliar opponent in front of him. This was also a kind of confidence. As he was afraid of scaring the other party away, he did not use the Sword River to open the path. When he sensed the fluctuation of breath in front of him, he could not help but laugh softly. Old friends. He had been unlucky in the 4 seasons barrier. Now, his luck had finally changed. Chapter 1081. By the time Bodhisattva Yang realized who his opponent was, he had already lost the distance to dodge. He had never thought that he would meet such an old foe in this place. A sworn enemy. If it was this guy, Bodhisattva Hongguang's death would not be in vain. Just like how the Dharma monks belonged to the school of supernatural powers, Bodhisattva Yang and Hongguang belonged to the school of merit. The swordsman's familiarity with merit was no less than his after the battle with him on Silu's desolate planet. Just like how a swordsman's flying sword was under his opponent's control, how was he supposed to fight? All of his strength was in the swastika. All of it was in his merit. If that was all, it would be fine. At most, they could compete with each other in the realm of merit. However, his own merit was crippled. There was a hidden loophole that outsiders did not know about. Half hypocrisy. In other words, as a senior Buddhist believer, his understanding of merit was not as deep as a swordsman's. Unimaginable. He also wanted to change it, but this thing was not like a belt that could be changed at will. This was something he had learned from his previous life when he was in the half-immortal realm. Theoretically, if he wanted to completely erase it and change the foundation of merit, he would have to reach the half-immortal realm to do so. There was no way to change it. What would he do in the thousands of years before reaching the half-immortal realm? If the swordsman leaked his secret, would he not be able to meet anyone? He had been hiding everywhere. Ever since the battle with Silu, he had never been close to the upper realm of Joseon. He had even hidden in a remote realm like Taigu. He did not expect to meet his nemesis. Without the power of the swastika, how long could he resist with ordinary Buddhist techniques? He could only try his best to escape and hope that his two companions would be able to intercept him. He made a judgment in an instant. He had no intention of fighting for his life. In the end, cultivation depended on the individual. The loss of Taigu would not affect the final result of the battle between the thousands of Buddhists in the universe. Just as he was about to escape, the swordsman opened his mouth. 15 minutes. I only have a little more than 15 minutes to deal with you. Any longer, and the monks behind me will catch up and join forces with you. However, I wasn't sure if I could take down a person who was running away in a moment. I'm not sure. This is a gamble. Yi Hang's expression was uncertain. He was ready to turn around and run away, even if he had to take a few hits from the swordsman, but he still stayed where he was. Subconsciously, he felt that there must be a better way to solve this problem, for the Buddhists and for himself. He couldn't keep running away like this forever, but we can choose not to bet. Perhaps there was a way for everyone to get by. It was just like how Buddhism and Taoism had coexisted for millions of years. In the end, they still managed to coexist, even if there were some obstacles. Neither you nor I can change the essence of the cultivation world. The decline of Taoism and the growth of Buddhism. The decline of Buddhism and the growth of Taoism. The decline of Buddhism and the growth of Taoism. You know this better than I do. Lu Xiaoyi narrowed his eyes and said coldly, "Take out the season eye and withdraw from the four seasons barrier. As a reward, I will never reveal the secret of your merit to anyone. Don't tell me that you need to think about it. People like you, and I don't need to think about these things." Lu Xiaoyi's flying sword flew out. The strength of the realm was the merit. Bodhisattva Yi Hang thought quickly and made up his mind. The damn swordsman was right about one thing. They couldn't change the essence. Even if they paid the price with their lives, how much help would it make for the great trend? This was Lu Xiaoyi's bait. He would never say that if Buddhism was to be promoted, it would require the selfless efforts of every monk in every event. Only when thousands of monks were selfless could there be a change in the trend of Buddhism. However, maybe it wouldn't make a difference if he was the only one. Lu Xiaoyi wouldn't say this to other determined monks. It would be a blasphemy to Buddhism. If every monk was so easily bewitched, Buddhism wouldn't have been able to prosper all these years. However, for Yi Hang, a half-deity monk who still played the part of alms, the falsehood of Buddhism was self-evident. Yi Hang was very straightforward. He made the decision in an instant, the decision that was most beneficial to his cultivation. He knew very well that the swordsman in front of him was the same as him. If he insisted, this guy would definitely not fight to the death here. He would definitely abandon the season eye and escape under the siege of the three. Then, he would spread the news of the fatal flaw of Yi Hang's merit to the entire universe. The Buddhists would gain a trivial victory, but he, Yi Hang, would lose everything. As an individual, how would he choose between the gains and losses? He took out the season eye and threw it to the swordsman. He said calmly, "I need a sword." Lu Xiaoyi nodded tacitly. Now wasn't the time to show off his arrogance. The flying sword's aura became more and more majestic. However, the realm of merit changed to massacre. This was because Yi Hang's current orthodox merit could not resolve it, but other realms of Tao could. At this point, Buddhism and Taoism were inverted. It was truly a pity. The flying sword's aura was very strong. It would definitely spread far and wide. It fell from high up and pierced through Yi Hang's body. Yi Hang's expression did not change. He said softly, "Remember your promise." He turned around and went through the wall. Lu Xiaoyi let out a sigh of relief. How could the top bodhisattvas of various universes be trifled with? He was Lu Xiaoyi, not Lu Xiaoxian. He had a clear understanding of his own strength. Weak true monarchs could be ambushed. Strong true monarchs could be avoided. He had nothing to fear in a one-on-one battle with Yuanying. A group of ordinary Yuanying posed no threat, just like Taoist Huang's group. Atop Yuanying, he had the confidence to fight 1 against 2. However, 1 against 3, there were too many variables. Take these 3 monks, for example. Each of them was in the realm of transcendent Tao, and one of them had the heavenly eye. Such a combination was not something he could easily deal with. God had given him this opportunity. If he wasted it, he would stupidly kill Yi Hang as soon as possible. It was only a moment, and the disadvantages outweighed the advantages. Never underestimate a beast that had no way out. If he forced Yi Hang into a corner, he might not be able to turn the tables. However, it would not be a problem for him to hold on for a moment. The swastika could not be used, but there were many other Buddhist teachings. When one reached the realm of Mahabodhisattva, they could comprehend by analogy. In fact, many things did not have to be tied to one tree. It had been more than 10 years since the battle outside Silu. It was hard to imagine that the monks would not have prepared other methods for him in such a long time. They knew that Lu Xiaoyi had the upper hand. If they waited passively, would they really be a coward? Yi Hang's decisiveness in leaving this time proved that he was not resigned to his fate. He must be preparing other methods, especially against Lu Xiaoyi. The biggest reason why he didn't use them now was that he wasn't familiar with them yet. This was a very dangerous beast. He knew when to advance and when to retreat. He could endure, all for the sake of turning the tables. He was looking forward to it. Chapter 1082. Although Yi Hang had left, he continued to move forward, albeit at a slower speed. Moreover, he had created a huge commotion by fighting with his left and right. He was a swordsman and had good karma. His fighting style was decent. Unless they saw it with their own eyes, who would know that it was a one-man show? His goal was to go further and leave no time for his pursuers to return. When there was no chance, he would not deliberately show off. However, when the opportunity presented itself, he would not let it go. Outside the Four Seasons barrier, a group of perfected monarchs from the Dragon Gate sect unconsciously gathered. Their faces were filled with worry. The situation was not good. Although they had considered that the Buddhists were well prepared and had asked for help before the battle, the Taoists' help had been prepared in a hurry. Therefore, their help was lacking in quality. The worst thing was that they had insisted on sending a cultivator from the Dragon Gate for the sake of their reputation. With this opening, the situation could not be salvaged. Not long after the battle began, the Soul Hall sent the bad news that the 1,000 Elements soul lamp had been extinguished. There were only 4 people in total. The death of one person had a huge impact on the overall situation because it meant that the Buddhists would soon be outnumbered. It was useless to regret sending the weaker Dragon Gate Taoists for the sake of reputation. The situation was already heading towards collapse and could not be salvaged. Then came the good news. Some of the monks had also been killed. It was just that they did not know who did it. The situation seemed to have returned to balance. However, not long after, the deaths of Du O and Xiao Xiao Zi caused the Taoists to lose all hope. According to Master Xiao Xiao, the 2 of them were defeated by the combined forces of the other 3. Obviously, the monks gathered faster than the Taoists and were more united. 1 against 3, there was no suspense. There was only a small possibility that the last swordsman could bring out a seasoned eye. This was because they had already heard from Xiao Xiao Zi that the 2 of them did not achieve any results. Qian Xing had also died early. Therefore, the only one who had the upper hand could only be the lone swordsman, One Ear. His reputation is not for nothing. In terms of battle strength, the swordsman's reputation is well-deserved. Sigh, we should have found a few more swordsmen. A perfected monarch said in hindsight, it should be an exception, right? Since when did carefree travel have such a powerful sword vein orthodoxy? However, we still have to thank them. At least we didn't lose too badly this time. Another true monarch was somewhat pessimistic. Mo Gu was even more pessimistic. My judgment is difficult. Miracles rarely appear. If young friend Dan is fast and lucky, he should have been out by now after 8 hours. Since he hasn't come out yet, it means that he hasn't reached the location of the season eye yet. There's still 3 people on the other side. If they surround him and intercept him, he won't stand a chance. If the Buddhists were to obtain 4 season eyes in one go, the reset of the 4 seasons would soon be initiated by the Buddhists. The Taoists had established a contract that could not be stopped. They had to cooperate. An old perfected lord smiled bitterly and said, "From now on, we have to prepare how to deal with the erosion of Buddhist faith. We haven't done much in this area. This is a mistake, and we have to pay attention to it. With the ability of the Buddhist faith to penetrate, not to mention tens of thousands of years, even if you only give them 1,000 years, they will still have the ability to dig out the roots of our Taoism." While everyone was in melancholy, a true monarch transmitted a message from the void. Another bodhisattva had been forced out of the barrier. Judging from his aura, he was also heavily injured. The situation had changed again, 1 against 2. With the strength of the swordsman, it was not impossible for him to turn the tables. Among the true monarchs present, the only young god, true monarch of the dragon sect, true monarch Yin Yuan, smiled. "This time, I owe senior brother Whitebrow a favor, boss. The next time we meet, I'm afraid I'll be at his mercy." Beggar Monk was very steady in his pursuit, neither too fast nor too slow. He knew that his companion Bodhisattva and Nightwalker's strength was above his own. His merit swastika was both offensive and defensive. He was the only one among the 4 who had no weaknesses in both offense and defense. He did not believe that he would be able to defeat junior brother Yang in less than 15 minutes. After flying for 45 minutes, he sensed a faint fluctuation of spiritual vigor in front of him. Someone was fighting. As he expected, it must be junior brother Yang and the swordsman fighting, although he was far away. As an experienced guardian monk, he could clearly distinguish the progress of the battle from the changes in the 2 Tao states. At least for now, it seemed like they were evenly matched. If that was the case, there was no need for him to show up immediately. Everyone has the heart to steal chickens and dogs. Sneak attacks were not only the favorite of swordsmen, but also the favorite of Dharma cultivators and monks. It was the favorite of all cultivators. In the cultivation world, there was no such thing as a sneak attack. Everyone called it the highest level of control over the environment, the people, and the situation. If a sneak attack was successful, it meant that one had the ability to do so. It was not a despicable and sinister move. Just like in a battlefield, the appearance of reinforcements was very important. If they arrived too early, the effect would be negligible. If they arrived too late, the battle would be meaningless. How could one suddenly appear at the most difficult time and catch them off guard? That was a true expert. Huayuan Monk was an expert. At least that was what he thought. Therefore, he was not in a hurry. He purposely slowed down his speed and placed his presence in a place where he could sense the fluctuations of the battle, but also outside the detection of the cultivator's divine sense. This distance was only a matter of 10 breaths for him. With junior brother Yahong's stable display of the Tao of Merit, he did not see any danger at all. The only thing that he was curious about was why junior brother Yang was retreating to the 3rd position instead of the 4th. He should know that there was no reinforcements coming from that direction. However, it was not a big deal. There were many changes in a battle. The direction of movement was very important. If the swordsman was purposely intercepting him at the 4th position, it was normal for Yang to retreat to the 3rd position. As long as he won in the end, it did not matter where he retreated, right? Huayuan Monk was a little self-righteous. He guessed that junior brother Yang was too arrogant and wanted to complete the kill by himself. He did not want to be held back by others. This was in line with the so-called Tao heart of some cultivators. When Huayuan Monk was young, he was also young and inexperienced. It was not surprising. Therefore, he continued to follow and follow. To his surprise, he realized that the Tao of Merit was slowly gaining the upper hand in the intense battle. Although the swordsman's slaughter, five elements, and Star Tao were constantly counterattacking and putting up a desperate struggle, they could not last long. After the swordsman's struggle, the Tao of Merit would always regain control. This battle was in the bag. Huayuan monk sighed in his heart. To deal with the orthodoxy like the swordsman, one had to start with the Tao realm of Buddhism. Chapter 1083. Begging monk's mentality relaxed. He began to hesitate. Should he go over or not? If he went over, would junior brother Yi Hang think that he was here to take advantage of the situation? If that happened, as fellow Buddhists, it wouldn't be good if it left a knot in everyone's heart. If he didn't go over, what if the swordsman retaliated? Or would he end up disrupting junior brother Yi Hang's rhythm? Begging monk was indeed very experienced. He had a good grasp of the human heart. His experience in the mortal world made him very clear that there were some things that even cultivators couldn't ignore. Relationships were also a great way. As he hesitated and was troubled, he suddenly realized that their position seemed to be very close to the third position. In other words, their current position was a full 2 hours away from senior brother Yi Hang's position at the fourth position. Weren't they walking a little too far? Just as he couldn't help but doubt himself, the aura in front of him suddenly became restless. Merit, slaughter, the five elements, and the stars were all mixed together, entangling, repelling, and devouring each other. It was getting more and more intense. Begging monk no longer hesitated and quickly flew up. He was very clear what this meant. It meant that the two sides were about to lay their cards on the table. Although junior brother Yahang's path of virtues had always been an obvious advantage, the dying struggles of the sword cultivators were well known in the world of cultivators. It was hard to say whether or not unexpected accidents would happen in a life-and-death battle. This was a good opportunity for him to get close. He could suddenly appear and control the situation without arousing the disgust of his junior brother. As he rushed up, before he could even see the two people in the battle, a long river of sword light was already hanging upside down. More than 200,000 sword lights filled the space around him. The pressure was so great that he couldn't breathe for a moment. He wanted to use divine arts and create clones, but the torrential rain of flying swords made all his efforts futile. Creating clones also required time. Even if this time was very short, just an instant was still time. He was very clear in his heart that even a split second was impossible under such dense flying swords. If he dared to use his clone, his real body and clone would be torn apart by the flying swords in the short time it took to cast the technique. He only had one thought now, and that was to use all his strength to block the flying sword's explosive attacks. He hoped that the swordsman's explosive attacks had a time limit and couldn't be sustained. Yes, he no longer placed his hopes on junior brother Yi Hang. This was a trap. When he saw more than 200,000 sword chi surging towards him, he immediately understood that this was a show directed by the crafty swordsman himself. There was only one spectator, and that was him, Monk Huayuan. How did the swordsman manage to create the virtuous Tao realm so vividly that even a Buddhist like him was fooled? This question was no longer important. The most important thing was how to avoid this calamity. His current position was extremely awkward. He was at the third location, and he was still 2 hours away from the fourth location. If he chose to fight while fleeing, he would need even more time. With the strength displayed by the swordsman, there was no way he could last that long. So he didn't run at all. He only chose to fight on the spot. As for whether or not he should throw away the season eye in exchange for his freedom, he didn't even consider it. Among the Buddhists, there were selfish people like Yi Hang, and there were also monks who were willing to contribute to the great cause of the Buddhists. He had still overestimated himself. His defense wasn't as strong as he thought, and the swordsman's explosive attacks lasted longer than he expected. Furthermore, the number of sword chi was still increasing. His Tao realm was also increasing. More than 200,000 sword chi contained different Tao realm powers, and this made it extremely difficult for him to defend himself. This was because he couldn't find the most suitable method to deal with it. He didn't have Heaven's Eye. Even if senior brother Huayuan had Heaven's Eye, what could he do in such a situation? So what if he could see through it? He had to make a move. His body was soon covered in wounds. Even with the toughness of his Buddhist body, he couldn't endure such endless destruction for long. He didn't even have time to recover, and he didn't even have the chance to consume a pill. But he still persevered. This was a kind of conviction. Even if he had to die, he would die in battle. At the very last moment, he finally understood why so many orthodoxies were defeated by the swordsmen. They were all attacking from afar. Even if he had an overwhelming advantage, the cunning swordsman didn't stop. His constantly changing body made it impossible for him to catch his target. Even if he wanted to, he still couldn't use his god's limbs. The sword chi was even denser. It was so dense that everything that came out would be instantly destroyed. He already had a clear understanding of his final destination. The only thing he couldn't understand was why junior brother Yi Hang, who was good at karma, was defeated so easily. He couldn't even hold on for a moment. He couldn't even use his divine ability, but he could still hold on for a moment. What happened? In the end, under the unyielding will of the Huayuan monk, the monk didn't receive any surprises. Yi Hang didn't appear. Huayuan didn't appear either. The sword chi was still surging, and he had already used up all his strength. It was a fail hunt. It wasn't a mistaken strategy, but a mistaken judgment. They thought they were hunting a wild wolf, but a fierce tiger came instead. If he knew this would happen, he wouldn't have separated the three of them, even if he was beaten to death. Before he died, the Huayuan monk looked at him with disdain. "You're not a swordsman. You're an actor." Lu Xiaoyi reached out his hand and took the ownerless seasoned eye floating in the air. He sighed in his heart. Although he respected the monk, it didn't affect his will to kill him. He got what he wanted. Sending the monk on his way was the greatest respect he could give him. This was the cultivation world. There was no right or wrong. His body slowly floated forward. He needed to recover the huge amount of magical energy he had lost before returning to Point 4. It was very difficult to defeat an opponent like this easily. Moreover, he had used up a lot of his magical energy in order to make it look real. This battle had verified his thoughts. Even if it was a divine ability, it was possible to be forced back and die without knowing why. No matter if it was a divine ability, a secret spell, a forbidden technique, a magical weapon, or a demonic beast, etc., there was a time limit to how long it could be used. As long as his sword was dense enough and heavy enough, he could suppress his opponent's attacks in all aspects. This was the meaning of using a flying sword to attack first. Snatch until death. The Huayuan monk was confused. He was still hesitating on what method to use when he saw the battlefield. But he didn't know that to a cultivator, it was most important to always be vigilant, because his acting was realistic enough. The monk was full of disdain before he died. Lu Xiaoyi was also full of disdain, looking down on a swordsman like him. Then what kind of swordsman would the monks like? They would definitely like the kind of hothead who would fight against 3 opponents and still shout loudly. The unyielding swordsman spirit. The unyielding attitude of fighting to the death. If all swordsmen were like that, the sword vein inheritance would have been broken long ago. Ever since the Huayuan monk and his heavenly eye senior brother joined hands, he didn't have the right to say such words. True magnanimity. The 3 monks each occupied a spot, waiting for others to challenge them. This was the true style of ancient cultivators. If that was the case, Lu Xiaoyi might not be able to do it. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.